Introduction: The Codex of Ash. The official history of humanity is not an objective record of the truth, but a thick containment wall built by frightened men. Those who wrote the annals of civilization and erected the institutions of knowledge needed with a biological and desperate urgency for the world to be solid, predictable, and unalterable. Otherwise, the immensity of the abyss would have driven them mad. Therefore, they took the most terrifying and asymmetric events of the past, those precise moments where dense matter yielded to the friction of a solitary will, and buried them under the anesthetic cloak of mysticism and legend. They labeled them as miracles. This was done to strip them of their true mechanical nature. By cataloguing a geological or thermodynamic alteration as an inexplicable whim of the gods, the slave is exempted from the responsibility of studying the phenomenon. He convinces himself that greatness is an accident of heaven and not the result of engineering. This engineering is acoustic, optical, and gravitational, applied with coldness. This text is the exhumation of the files that orthodoxy decided to incinerate to protect its own fragility. What you have before you is the codex rescued from that ash, a treatise that rips the impossible from its magical altar. It subjects it to the crucible of quantum physics, fluid mechanics, and the strength of materials. The individuals who star in these forbidden stories were not martyrs touched by ethereal grace. They were architects of perception, master metallurgists who understood that the universe is not a block of deaf stone. Instead, they knew it is an immense and tense resonator that yields to the exact frequency. They knew that water, fire, steel, and flesh possess no authority of their own, but obey with mathematical docility the atmospheric pressure and structural tension of whoever observes them with the proper crystalline lens. Hiding this mechanics was always a matter of survival for the empires of inertia. If the multitude comes to understand that the laws of matter can be curved through the optical concentration of a single human solar furnace, the tyranny of fear crumbles into dust. If you discover you are not a victim of the environment, if you find you are the reactor core that dictates the climate, the control structures that keep you on your knees instantly lose their pulling power. That is why they erased the operating manuals. That is why they persecuted the true alchemists, those who did not mix vulgar metals in cauldrons, but used the friction of solitude. They used that friction to transmute the lead of their own terror into the solid gold of an unshakable will. Entering these pages requires you to abandon the comfort of the inexplicable forever. Here you will not find mystical forces that save the weak, but the raw anatomy of how human attention can alter reality. When attention is isolated from entropy and sharpened like a scalpel, it is capable of altering the atomic lattice of reality. The APOCRYPHA of the mind have been unearthed, and the heavy doors of the vault are open. Enter the darkness, breathe the dust of forgotten titans, and assume command over the physics of the impossible. Chapter 1: The Acoustics of Jericho and the Collapse of Gravity. The history of civilization is a pantheon of comforting lies, a gallery of fables meticulously designed by frightened scribes to hide the true and relentless mechanics of the universe. When the ordinary man faces an event of catastrophic magnitude, a structural collapse that defies logic, his fragile mind breaks. Unable to comprehend the pure glacial physics that bend matter, the slave resorts to magic. He calls a miracle that which is, in reality, the absolute triumph of thermodynamic engineering and vibratory optics applied by a superior will. The tale of the fall of the walls of Jericho is the most grotesque example of this. For millennia, you have been told the story of an army of nomads who, after walking around an impregnable fortress, played some trumpets and saw the walls collapse by the grace of divine wrath descending from the heavens. You have been taught to read this as a tale of blind faith and religious reward. This interpretation is an insult to the intelligence of titans and a blasphemy against the laws of acoustics and the resistance of materials. The walls of Jericho did not fall because an ethereal entity decided to push them with an invisible finger. There was no magic in the desert sand. What occurred before those limestone walls was the tactical execution of the most devastating, precise, and elegant siege weapon known to the cosmos, destructive acoustic resonance and structural fatigue induced by the manipulation of the vibratory field. It was the empirical demonstration that dense matter is simply a lattice of atoms. No matter how thick it is, any atomic lattice has an exact breaking point if the correct electromagnetic frequency is injected. To understand the magnitude of this metallurgical operation, you must first understand the anatomy of arrogance. Visualize Jericho not as a myth, but as a triumph of ancient civil engineering. Erected upon bedrock, the city was surrounded by a system of double concentric walls, solid stone retaining walls topped by thick sun-baked brick designed to withstand the impact of the heaviest rams and catapult rocks. For the inhabitants, those walls were not just a defense, they were the geological crystallization of their ego. They were a monument to the illusion of solidity. The kings of Jericho walked the battlements, looked toward the horizon, observed the thickness of their own stone, and felt the warm and stupid security of cowards who believe that inert matter can protect them from the will of a monarch. When the invading army reached the plains, the defenders looked out and laughed. The optics of the men of Jericho were the optics of the inertial slave. They measured power in terms of muscle mass and brute force. Seeing an army that brought no siege towers or rams, they concluded the threat was zero. Their brains, conditioned by the basic physics of impact, dictated that wood and flesh cannot pass through granite. They felt invulnerable. But the defenders were ignorant that the commander was not a butcher of conventional war. He was an architect of waves, an engineer who understood that striking an obstacle is the tactic of animals. The commander knew that true domination does not consist of breaking the wall from the outside, but of forcing the wall to destroy itself from within. Here begins the great lesson of thermal sovereignty. The first command was not a war cry, but the imposition of an absolute glacial and dictatorial silence. He ordered thousands of armed men to march around the fortress in a slow, heavy, and rhythmic procession without emitting a single syllable. Imagine the density of that scene. An infantry sea, moving with clockwork precision, but surrounded by an anechoic chamber of its own creation. Silence is a high-capacity capacitor. It is a black hole that begins to absorb the oxygen from the environment. For 6 days, the army marched around the monument to arrogance, 1 turn per day. The rhythmic sound of thousands of boots hitting the dry earth began to generate micro-tremors, low-frequency seismic waves that traveled through the geological substrate. This march was not a superstitious ritual, it was the accumulation of torsional tension. It was the tightening of the spring. While they marched in absolute muteness, the soldiers were not passive. They were concentrating the immense energy of their intention, creating a solar furnace of gravitational expectation. From atop the walls, the defenders' perception began to fracture. The first day they laughed. The second, they murmured in confusion. By the 4th day, primitive, dark, reptilian fear began to drip into their amygdalae. The human mind does not know how to process the unshakable advance of a silent threat. The enemy's silence generates a vacuum, and the defender's brain, terrified by the lack of information, is forced to fill that vacuum with its own nightmares. The psychological structure of Jericho began to crack long before the first stone fell. The commander used silence to suffocate the city's emotional temperature. But psychological warfare was only preparatory friction. The true holocaust of matter was about to be executed in the realm of molecular physics. The science of modern acoustics reveals an undeniable truth. No single object in the 3D universe is truly at rest. A steel block or a stone wall are not inert objects. They are immense hives of atoms held by electromagnetic bonds, all vibrating constantly in place. Due to its mass and exact geometry, every solid object in creation possesses what engineers call a natural resonant frequency. It is the secret heartbeat of its structure. If you take a fine glass and a singer emits any note, the sound wave hits and dissipates. The glass withstands the impact because the frequency does not match its internal heartbeat. But if the singer tunes his vocal cords with lethal precision to the natural resonant frequency of the glass, massive energy transfer occurs. The external sound wave enters into phase with the internal vibration of the atoms. The atoms absorb that energy without resistance. The amplitude of their internal vibration multiplies exponentially. The wave does not hit the glass from the outside. It enters it, possesses it, and shakes it with unbridled thermal violence. In seconds, the induced vibration exceeds the material's elastic modulus. The bonds holding the silicon atoms are strained to their peak of fatigue, and suddenly the glass shatters into 1,000 pieces. It was not destroyed by an iron hammer. It was disintegrated because someone discovered its acoustic password. The seventh day dawned with a heavy stillness. The army did not march once, it marched 7 times, tightening the circle, increasing the geological friction. The silence capacitor had reached its maximum capacity. The torsional tension was unbearable. Then the commander gave the order to release the energy. The priests raised the shofars, ram's horns carved to act as precision acoustic transducers. They did not blow them to make music. They emitted a sustained, grave, and harsh frequency designed to cut the dense desert air like a diamond saw. Simultaneously, tens of thousands of men opened their lungs. The war cry was not a scream of uncontrolled fury. It was a thermodynamic shockwave, an explosion of acoustic density charged with the unshakable certainty of victory. Visualize the physics of that millisecond. Tens of thousands of human vocal cords and horn instruments emitting a longitudinal wave front. That immense wall of invisible pressure collided with the immense wall of limestone. And here the engineering miracle was consummated. The combined frequency, amplified by the electromagnetic field of their unified attention, coincided exactly with the natural resonant frequency of the walls of Jericho. When the wave front hit the stone, it did not bounce. It entered the limestone blocks. It crossed the mortar. It penetrated the clay bricks. The immense kinetic energy of the cry was absorbed by the atomic structure of the wall. The calcium and carbon atoms within the rock began to vibrate with disproportionate fury. The amplitude of the internal oscillation multiplied in a fraction of a second, feeding back through the phenomenon of constructive interference. The wall began to shake from its own dark core. Granite has no capacity to stretch. When the acoustic shockwave forced matter to expand, architecture had to surrender. The mortar pulverized into clouds of calcareous dust. The massive stones, losing the cohesion of their atomic lattice, fractured into millions of simultaneous cracks. The foundations gave way. With a crash that made the ears of time bleed, the walls of Jericho collapsed vertically upon themselves. They were not pushed in by a ram. They were disintegrated by material fatigue. Gravity, once the ally of the builders, became the executioner that pulled the debris toward the abyss. The wall liquefied, transforming the barrier into a ramp of grey rubble over which the infantry ascended to annihilate the empire. The slave reads this story and sighs, believing he has read a lesson on religious obedience. The architect of the now reads this story and discovers the blueprints to dynamite any 3D obstacle that dares to stand between him and the crown. Jericho is the testament to the superiority of vibratory optics. In your economic and social matrix, you face your own walls daily. You face monopolized industries that look like stone fortresses. You face authority figures who have raised walls of arrogance. You face barriers that the herd of the mediocre observes with terror, declaring them impossible to cross. 2. The ordinary man acts like the barbarian with a hammer. He attacks head-on. He wears himself out. He offers discounts. He pleads for attention. And the wall of the industry, dense and indifferent, breaks his bones of frustration and leaves him exhausted. He assumes he failed because the wall was too strong. The architect never attacks stone with flesh. He understands that the market or the crisis is not solid stone. They are an illusion of dense matter, possessing a specific resonance frequency. The sacred duty of the leader is to become a quantum acoustic engineer and discover the exact note that will make the problem collapse. If you wish to tear down a wall, the first step is the silent march. You must apply tactical blindness and the silent siege. Do not announce your plans. Do not seek approval. Do not generate unnecessary friction. By surrounding your target with military coldness, you accumulate potential energy in the system. You study the market. You find its micro-flaws. You identify the arrogance in its structure, because arrogance is the point of maximum rigidity. In material science, the rigid is the first to fracture under vibratory tension. The silence of your advance acoustically isolates the competition. You march around their defenses with psychopathic discipline, tuning the fork of your own chest. You inject the gravity of certainty into your bloodstream. You refuse to vibrate at the frequency of scarcity. You install the quantum lead of inevitable victory, knowing you compete against atoms about to receive a wave. And when time folds upon itself, when logistics are aligned and the atmospheric pressure in your will has reached boiling point, you stop before the wall. You do not ask permission. You raise the horn of your own authority. You expose your asymmetric product to the 3D world. The cry of your execution is not a physical sound. It is the projection of concentrated energy. It is the purity of value so undeniable that it clashes directly against the market's resonance. Sympathetic resonance kicks in. Old structures, unable to absorb your wavelength, vibrate beyond their limit. The obstacle offers no heroic resistance. There is no bloody battle at the gates. Before the crushing magnitude of the acoustics you just deployed, matter yields. Contracts break, bureaucracies disintegrate. The wall pulverizes from its foundations and falls at your feet, forming a ramp you ascend to take the gold. This is the secret that official history decided to erase. They lied to make you believe greatness belongs to those with more muscle. The physical truth is much darker and more liberating. The mountain does not move by pushing. The mountain crumbles when the observer refuses to recognize its solidity. Gravity is not an unshakable law that keeps you tied to mediocrity. It is simply the language of mass, and the universe always obeys the greater mass. When the thermodynamic density of your own consciousness becomes superior to the problems around you, gravity inverts. Walls fall to let you pass. Put away your hammer. Brute force is the tool of slaves who build prisons for others. Take the steel tuning fork of acoustic knowledge. Breathe the geometric coldness of empty space. Stand before the fortress of your old terrors, tune the frequency in your chest, and force them to collapse. Chapter 2. The Fire of Syracuse and the Furnace of Consciousness. Official history, drafted by frightened minds and trembling hands, has tried to convince you that power is a matter of raw accumulation. You have been taught to measure the strength of an empire by the number of its soldiers, the thickness of its iron shields, and the tonnage of its wood. The narrative of the weak establishes that the big fish always devours the small, that muscular mass always crushes intelligence, and that, faced with the immensity of a colossal war machine, the only logical response for a lone individual is surrender, flight, or pleading to the gods. This is the foundational lie of the inertial slave. It is the thermodynamic deception that keeps you kneeling before the stone giants of your own era. However, in the hidden archives of humanity, far from moralistic fables and cheap poetry, lies the file of Syracuse. An event that shattered the illusion of brute force and demonstrated that massive matter is merely cheap fuel. It is fuel waiting to be ignited by a consciousness that has learned to govern the trajectory of light. To understand the magnitude of the physical aberration that took place on the shores of the Ionian Sea in 212 BCE, you must immerse yourself in the thermal despair of a besieged city. Visualize the Roman Republic, the most implacable military crushing machine the ancient world had forged, deploying its wrath upon Syracuse. The fleet of Marcus Claudius Marcellus was not simply a group of ships. It was a floating wall of solid oak, tempered steel, and tens of thousands of legionaries trained to massacre. The Roman quinqueremes darkened the horizon, blocking the sunlight and casting a shadow of imminent death over the city walls. The psychological impact on the citizens of Syracuse was what is expected of any congregation of inertial slaves. Absolute entropic collapse. At the sight of that incalculable mass, the citizens lost control. They ran in circles through the cobblestone streets, screamed, tore their garments, brought useless offerings to stone temples, and dispersed their valuable vital energy in a million chaotic directions. Panic is, in strict thermodynamic terms, the maximum expression of entropy. It is the inability of a system to retain its heat and form. The inhabitants were pouring the light of their attention over the size of the Roman ships, the glint of their swords, and their own nightmares of slavery. They were illuminating their own misfortune with a diffuse, weak, and sickly light that did not alter the reality of the attack, but simply accelerated their own exhaustion. The slave always spends his energy observing the monstrosity of the problem, giving gravitational mass to the enemy and cooling his own chest until he is frozen in paralysis. But in the highest tower of the Syracuse fortifications, isolated from the strident noise of laments, stood the true and only monarch of that space-time fraction. Archimedes was not a sorcerer or a priest. He was the supreme architect of geometry and materials physics. While his people wept looking at the ships, he observed them with the cold, mechanical and bored apathy of an engineer evaluating the combustible properties of a dry log. Archimedes did not see the Roman legion as an invincible monster. His perceptive lens, immaculate and purged of the cataracts of the ego and mammalian terror, decomposed the enemy fleet into its true atomic variables: metric distance, ballistic trajectory, thermal absorption coefficient, and structural vulnerability. To him, the Roman ships were not the conquering empire. They were floating carbon and cellulose. They were wood, and wood, by the unshakable mandate of the physical universe, obeys fire. Archimedes' lethal genius did not lie in inventing a new type of fuel or forging larger cannons. His invention was a direct affront to the dispersion of energy. He understood that the sky above harbored a thermonuclear reactor. The sun. The sun bombards the Earth's surface with an amount of radiant energy that escapes human imagination. However, because this light travels in parallel waves and scatters upon entering the atmosphere, its impact on the wood of the Roman ships was harmless. It barely managed to warm the decks and dry the sweat of the legionaries. Natural light is democratic, peaceful, and docile. It is a diffuse energy that caresses matter without demanding a change of state. Archimedes detested diffuse light. He understood that the secret of annihilation lay not in generating more energy than already existed, but in applying an implacable geometric tyranny over the energy flowing. To achieve this domination, he designed a series of colossal parabolic mirrors, forged in bronze and polished to a terrifying optical perfection. The parabolic mirror is not a simple reflective surface. It is a mathematical trap for photons. Its curvature is designed with specific cruelty. It forces every light ray to bounce at an exact angle. It forces them to converge inexorably at a single three-dimensional point in space, known as the focus. Archimedes ordered his most disciplined soldiers to align these immense bronze shields along the walls, pointing them at the fleet of Marcellus. In that precise instant, the peaceful sunlight was hijacked and forced to obey one man. What followed is the greatest lesson in material domination ever recorded. Immense beams of sunlight bounced off the polished bronze. Millions of photons that previously traveled in docile lines were forced to collide, compress, and concentrate into focal points the size of a gold coin projected directly onto the dark wood hulls. The physics of thermal impact admits no negotiations. When that ultra-concentrated light touched the wood, the atomic lattice of the quinqueremes went into shock. Carbon atoms began to vibrate with unrestrained hysteria. The temperature in that tiny focal point spiked from 30 degrees Celsius to 600 in seconds. The cellulose could not withstand the atomic friction. The ignition threshold was broken. Without a single flaming arrow crossing the sky, the solid wood of the most powerful fleet in the world simply erupted in flames from its own interior. Black smoke began to rise from the center of the sea. The fire expanded with a devouring fury. Visualize the absolute terror and cognitive dissonance in the minds of the Roman soldiers. They were men hardened by the war of iron and shield, used to facing the enemy and measuring victory in spilled blood. But now their ships were becoming floating crematoriums, and they had no one to run their swords through. They could not block the light with their shields. They could not extinguish a fire falling from the sun. They were being annihilated by a phenomenon that escaped their brute understanding. Admiral Marcellus, watching the pride of Rome reduced to incandescent ashes, understood that an empire's military force is worthless against a focused mind. Archimedes did not defeat Rome with muscles. He incinerated it by refusing to disperse light. That parabolic mirror of polished bronze is not an obsolete artifact of antiquity. It is the exact X-ray of your own perceptive apparatus, the fundamental lens of human consciousness that resides behind your eyes. And the grotesque tragedy of your current existence, the reason you feel fatigue and your empire does not materialize, is because you have been using your own parabolic mirror backwards. Or worse, you have shattered it into 1,000 pieces, allowing the light of your immense thermodynamic energy to disperse in useless frozen reflections. The ordinary man wakes up and voluntarily submits to the siege of a fleet much more destructive than the Roman one, the fleet of three-dimensional noise. He opens his eyes and immediately turns on screens that vomit global crises, political laments, and the plasticized lives of individuals he does not even know. Then he walks to work and absorbs the complaints of colleagues, the pessimism of relatives, and the chronic fear floating in the atmosphere of mediocrity. Faced with this invasion, what does the slave's mind do? It tries to look at everything. It tries to worry about everything. It distributes the sacred photons of its life force in 10,000 directions. This dispersion of attention is thermodynamic suicide. When you worry about the national economy, your in-laws' opinion, and the uncertain future of your industry, you are sending a thread of light to each of those wooden hulls. But because the light is so divided, it lacks the temperature necessary to alter matter. You barely manage to warm the surface of your problems. You grant them enough energy to keep them alive, to give them gravitational mass in your psyche, but you never reach the ignition point to destroy them. You become a dying sun, a worn-out filament bulb that illuminates a huge room but lets those within it freeze to death. You exhaust yourself and wonder why your reality does not change. Reality does not change because the dense matter of the 3D world despises diffuse light. Matter only bows the knee, moans, and melts when subjected to the tyranny of millimetric focus. The architect of the now imposes a discipline the herd would classify as cold sociopathy. The architect understands that his capacity for attention, the laser beam of his mental focus, is the most scarce, lethal, and costly asset in the known universe. Therefore, he flatly refuses to spill a single drop of that light on the rotten wood of distraction. To build the furnace of consciousness, you must apply tactical blindness. You must climb your own tower, close the heavy oak doors of your internal castle, and isolate yourself from the weeping of the citizens of Syracuse inhabiting your mind. You have to actively ignore 99% of the visible universe. You do not care who wins elections or if the stock market fluctuates. You must take the immense bronze shield of your mind and polish it until your arms ache. Strip away the dross of guilt. Tear off the rust of social duty. And when the surface of your inner mirror is an abyss of perfect reflection, you turn it. Give your back to the world's noise and point it toward a single point on the horizon of your empire. If your goal is the conquest of a financial monopoly or the forging of a literary masterpiece, that goal becomes the only physical object allowed to exist in your universe's geometry. You force millions of photons, the electromagnetic force of your heart, and the weight of your quantum lead to converge exactly on the atomic nucleus of that obstacle. The act of keeping this mirror focused is the only true war a Titan fights in his existence. Because the physical universe, which is lazy and adores chaos, will try by all means to shake your hands. It will send you false emergencies. A relative will fall ill with minor drama. A critic will insult you in the public square. A secondary business opportunity will appear, seducing you to divide the beam. If your hands tremble for a single millisecond, the focal point moves. The beam spreads. The temperature drops drastically. The carbon of the obstacle cools, hardens, and survives. Thermodynamic concentration requires absolute immobility. You have to look at the stone block, the wall of the industry you wish to tear down, and nail your gaze to it with the heaviness of an iron statue. You do not blink. You do not lament the heat. You endure the boredom. You endure the acoustic pressure of doubt, trying to infiltrate your anechoic chamber, and you hold the glass over the material. Observe the physics of what happens when a man refuses to withdraw his gaze. At first, 3D reality seems not to respond. The world is massive and suffers from severe inertial lag. The oak of the enemy ship does not burst into flames the instant light touches it. It needs time to absorb heat and for its molecules to agitate. The slave, seeing no immediate results after a couple of hours, withdraws the mirror and declares the method useless. The architect knows fire is inevitable and simply waits. He knows it is not a matter of luck, but of thermal critical mass. You hold the light. you increase the atmospheric pressure of your certainty. Your body becomes a conductor of static electricity, and suddenly, without prior warning, the breaking point is reached. The barrier that seemed like impenetrable granite begins to smoke. The inaccessible client feels the invisible burn of your unshakable authority and submits to your terms. The project, stuck in a bureaucratic labyrinth, finds an exit that opens like a crater in molten metal. The bank account suddenly erupts in an avalanche of capital flows, violently attracted by the gravitational vortex of a mind that has evaporated doubt. External reality catches fire. Old paradigms, loyalties to mediocre people, and the mathematical resistance of the industry are reduced to white ashes that the wind of success sweeps away with total indifference. And you, from atop your bronze tower, observe the smoke not with euphoria, but with the cold, calculating assent of the engineer who made the right calculations. To understand the fire of Syracuse is to assimilate the most dangerous and censored secret in the history of power. Matter has no will to protect itself from the temperature of your consciousness. The obstacles separating you from absolute wealth are merely dry wood disguised as steel. They are dead structures, standing only because the vast majority of the human race is too scared and distracted to focus the light long enough. The great deception is making you believe you must build cannons and catapults, that you must compete sweating blood in the mud alongside pigs and mercenaries. They made you believe the empire is won through friction and pushing heavy things. You do not have to push anything. You have to stop struggling with the 3D world. You must leave the plane and climb to the top of your own skull. You have to melt all resentment and anxiety and use that liquid metal to forge the mirror. When the universe tries to bombard you with its fleet of distractions, do not run, do not hide. Align the curve of your mind. Catch the brutal and eternal light of the unified field and twist it with the force of your arrogance. Become the lens, become the focus, and become the flame. You are the spark. Burn it all. Chapter 3. Flamel's Transmutation and the Internal Forge. For centuries, official history has tolerated the existence of alchemy only as a footnote, a folkloric curiosity starring delusional old men boiling metals in dark basements, chasing the childish fantasy of converting vulgar lead into solid gold. Inertial academics have labeled these hermetic texts as the babblings of a primitive science. They have taught you to mock the figure of Nicolas Flamel, reducing him to a charlatan or a dreamer who lost his sanity in front of a smoking cauldron. This is perhaps one of the most masterful and successful disinformation campaigns ever perpetrated by orthodoxy to protect the masses from the knowledge of their own divinity. The fundamental error of humanity has been reading alchemical grimoires with a pathetic literalness. The true masters of antiquity were never interested in altering the atomic structure of an inert piece of metal to enrich themselves in the market. Their 3D wealth was simply a secondary consequence, an inescapable gravitational echo. Alchemy was not a treatise on industrial chemistry. It was the most dangerous manual of ballistic and thermodynamic operations in the universe, encoded under the language of metallurgy to prevent low-vibration slaves from incinerating themselves. The lead spoken of in ancient texts was human biology in its state of primitive terror. And gold was not the currency of kings. Gold was the consciousness of the architect, incorruptible, dense, crystallized, and sovereign. Under the relentless lens of crystallography and materials physics, lead is a metal fascinating for its weakness. It possesses a deceptive density, but its atomic structure is soft, malleable, and toxic. Shutterstock. It oxidizes easily, deforms under minimal mechanical pressure, and has a miserably low melting point. The ordinary human, the individual operating at the 200 Hz frequency, is the biological incarnation of lead. His mind is structured by extremely fragile atomic bonds. He deforms before criticism and oxidizes with resentment. He melts under the pressure of fear and is deeply toxic to himself and those around him. He walks through the 3D world, dragging the dead weight of childhood traumas, convinced that his heaviness is a permanent geological condition. Understanding Flamel requires recognizing an internal technology capable of altering covalent bonds. The Philosopher's Stone, that mythical catalyst described as a red powder, was never a physical object. The Philosopher's Stone is human attention, purified of all entropy, focused like an industrial laser, and applied with ruthless friction upon one's own flesh. It is the collapse of observation onto one's own weakness. To execute this transmutation, you must build a crucible capable of withstanding temperatures that would melt the sanity of the rabble. In metallurgical engineering, the crucible is the refractory ceramic or graphite vessel designed to contain metals under hellish temperatures. Your crucible is the geometric solitude of your own chest. The vast majority of humans never initiate the forge because their crucibles are cracked by the need for validation. As soon as they feel the heat of internal pain, they run to complain or distract themselves, spilling the thermal energy and cooling the process before the matter can mutate. Inside this voluntary hell, the architect throws all his lead. He throws his fear of financial ruin, his terror of solitude, and the trembling voice of his parents who taught him to conform. He does not flee the pain. He embraces it with the brutality of an executioner. He applies the atmospheric pressure of isolation and ignites the boilers of sociopathic self-criticism. This thermodynamic process causes a phenomenon that alchemy calls nigredo, the work in black. As the heat increases, the molecular structure of the ego begins to disintegrate. The individual experiences a structural depression where everything he believed himself to be becomes liquid and chaotic. The slave, if he ever reaches this point by accident, panics and flees toward distraction. But the solitary king knows that the putrefaction of old matter is the only mathematically acceptable prelude to the crystallization of the new. He remains motionless in the center of his own fire. He lets the heat destroy his victimhood. As psychological lead reaches its melting point, the most violent and necessary event occurs, the separation of slag. No metal in its natural state is pure. Lead extracted from the earth is contaminated with silica and sulfur. When the heat is extreme, these lighter impurities separate and float to the surface as a toxic crust. It is imperative to observe how the architect deals with slag. Tears of frustration, fits of irrational rage, and doubts at 3 a.m. are strictly and literally chemical slag floating to the surface. Your duty is to take the titanium skimmer of your icy will and scrape that crust out of your system. True alchemy demands that, once the slag is purged, the furnace temperature rises further until reaching the territory of rubedo, the reddening of matter. It is here where sustained pressure and the injection of a new geometric frequency force the atoms to reorganize into a new crystalline lattice. Visualize the atomic structure of gold. Unlike lead, gold is a noble metal. Its crystal lattice is of a face-centered cubic perfection, giving it overwhelming density and absolute immunity to oxidation. You can bury a gold coin at the bottom of a corrosive ocean for 5,000 years, and it will not have lost a milligram of mass. Shutterstock. Gold does not react to the chaos of the environment. Gold simply is. When the individual endures the friction of isolation to the end, his psychology adopts this same incorruptible configuration. A wave collapse occurs inside his brain. Fragility evaporates and is replaced by the golden crown. The transmuted architect walks through the same acid rain of the 3D matrix and receives the same corrosive criticism from the herd, but his new atomic structure is immune. Hostility bounces off his polished surface without generating a single chemical reaction. He has reached the incorruptibility of noble metal. This is the thermal sovereignty that Flamel discovered. The master understood that if a man achieves internal stability and forges a will of solid gold, the 3D universe, which is nothing more than a passive sounding board, will have no choice but to alter its own laws to reflect the new mass of the observer. Gold attracts gold. Density demands density. If your bank account is fragile and your life seems a stage of perpetual scarcity, it is useless to strike the external mirror. The universe is shouting at you that your internal structure is still made of lead. The 3D environment is only responding to the vibration of your fear. To execute the miracle of attraction, you must dive into the mechanism of tempering. In advanced metallurgy, when metal is heated to white heat, the blacksmith does not let it cool slowly. Slow cooling allows atoms to relax, returning the metal to its original weakness. He plunges it into a barrel of ice water. This monstrous thermal shock freezes the atoms in their position of maximum tension. The metal screams and steam fills the room, but it acquires a hardness that can cut stone. When you have visualized your victory until feeling it as a fait accompli, you must perform the tempering of your own psyche. You have to take that new burning identity and plunge it into the freezing water of the 3D world. You do not stay meditating in a cave. That is cowardice disguised as spirituality. The architect opens the door of his fortress and walks directly into the boardroom, exposing his new configuration to reality. It is in this exact millisecond where alchemy is sealed forever or destroyed. You must keep the muscles of your face icy. You refuse to contract. By not yielding to the external shock, the atoms of your new identity lock in place. You have tempered the blade. Your natural state is now absolute sovereignty. All matter surrounding you will begin to yield under the weight of this new alloy. Bureaucratic walls melt like warm wax. Financial abundance stops being a skittish prey you must hunt in the mud. It becomes a river of liquid metal flowing downhill, drawn toward the basin of your massive gravity. The Codex of Ash reveals that the true miracle was never violating the laws of physics. The miracle was discovering that the laws of physics are designed to pay homage to the observer who knows how to apply them upon himself. Alchemy is the final rebellion against the lethargy of the flesh. It is the repudiation of victimhood. Turn off the voices of the herd demanding humility. Ignite the furnaces of your own isolation. Throw the corpse of your past weakness into the crucible. Scrape the slag of your fear until all that remains is a bright, heavy, icy, and blinding metal. Flamel discovered that man is a furnace, and gold was always hidden in the pressure of the will. Chapter 4. The Ice Monks and Thermodynamic Sovereignty. There is a biological submission so deeply rooted in the human species that it has been accepted as an unshakable law of nature, an unquestionable dogma that dictates the life and death of common men. It is the tyranny of the environment. From the instant the first hominid trembled with cold in the darkness of a cave, humanity was indoctrinated. The human race was taught that the body and mind are simple passive thermometers, pathetic instruments designed solely to register and obey the climate of the outside world. If winter strikes, the flesh freezes and the spirit becomes depressed. If the sun shines, blood flows and the mood rises. Orthodox science baptized this surrender. They called it reactive homeostasis and thermal equilibrium. You have been taught, with an academic cruelty disguised as biology, that you are a thermodynamic victim of your geography, your economy, and the barometric pressure of your era. The 200 Hz inertial slave carries this submission from the physical to the psychological. He walks through the three-dimensional matrix believing his internal temperature, his ambition, his security, must be dictated by the environment. If the financial market is icy and restrictive, the slave cools his projects, freezes his investments, and trembles with fear. If society emits cold indifference, the slave suffers emotional hypothermia. His veins contract, his will crystallizes, and he dies in paralysis. The ordinary individual is a vessel with cracks that allows the outside universe to invade his engine room and turn off his boilers. He accepts the cold of adversity as a death sentence dictated by a supreme judge without understanding that cold has no real existence. Classical physics and thermodynamics reveal a devastating truth. Cold is not a force, it is not an entity, it has no mass or velocity. Cold is solely and exclusively the absence of molecular agitation. It is the vacuum left when heat has fled. By the mandate of the second law of thermodynamics, heat always flows from the warmer body. It flows toward the colder abyss in an unceasing attempt by the universe to reach a dead and tepid equilibrium known as entropy. The external environment, the mediocrity of the masses, and daily tragedies do not have the power to inject cold into you. What they do, with the precision of a structural vampire, is absorb your heat. They steal the atomic agitation from your chest because you, in your optical ignorance, leave the floodgates of your fortress wide open. The tragedy is not that the world is freezing. The tragedy is that you have agreed to give away your fire to try to warm the abyss, and in the process, you have committed thermal suicide. To destroy this fallacy of climatic submission and claim the crown of invulnerability, We must leave the sterile laboratories of the West and ascend to the most hostile coordinates on Earth. We must raise our optics toward the peaks of the Himalayas, where oxygen is a rarity, atmospheric pressure crushes the lungs, and ice is king. In this hell of white ice and black rock, where any ordinary mammal would die of exposure in hours, with blood turning into ice crystals tearing through their own veins, there exist records of a thermodynamic anomaly. We speak of the hermit monks who practiced the forbidden art of tummo, the inner fire. These individuals were not priests begging gods to change the weather. They were engineers of biological combustion. Historical records and hermetic empirical tests describe how these men, dressed only in thin cotton robes or completely naked, ascended to snowy caverns at 4,000 meters in the heart of the Tibetan winter. They sat in perpetual snow, upon cutting ice, assuming the geometric immobility of a granite statue. The proof of their mastery, the initiation rite of their thermodynamic sovereignty, consisted of a demonstration that violates all expectations of human physiology. Their disciples took thick sheets and soaked them in freezing water. They wrapped the naked bodies of the monks with these soaked and deadly cloths. For an ordinary human body, this is an immediate death sentence. Freezing water accelerates thermal conduction, stealing the body's core heat at a dizzying speed. A slave's heart would collapse, the brain would enter lethargy, and organs would shut down. But the monarch of ice is not a slave to his skin. When the frigid sheet touched his flesh, the monk did not contract, he did not tremble. Trembling is the pathetic response of the autonomic nervous system of a frightened animal trying to generate heat through muscular friction and panic. The monk executed a coup against his brainstem. He isolated his consciousness in the vaulted chamber of his mind, and with the precision of a heavy machinery operator, closed the thermal escape valves of his biology. He flatly refused to recognize the authority of the external ice. Through an optical concentration so dense it curved space-time, the monk directed his attention. He directed the laser of his attention toward the base of his spine. He was not imagining heat, he was injecting a dictatorial order into the nucleus of his cells. He was forcing the mitochondria of his brown adipose tissue to trigger a process of non-shivering thermogenesis, a pure metabolic combustion. By focusing his consciousness on a single point, completely ignoring the stinging pain of ice on his shoulders, the monk altered the vibratory frequency of his own blood. He ignited a nuclear reactor in his entrails. Heat began to radiate from the center of his abdomen, traveling through the bloodstream and the spine. What happened next forced witnesses to bow in reverence before the majesty of human consciousness. Steam began to rise from the frozen sheet. The frozen water, upon contact with the monk's skin, which now burned at controlled feverish temperatures, reached its boiling point. White vapor enveloped the static figure. In a matter of minutes, the sheet was completely dry, toasted by the scorching heat emanating from the human body. And the monk did not stop there. He dried 3, 4, 5 frozen sheets in the course of a night, in the middle of a blizzard, using only the atomic friction generated by the weight of his own attention. Do not read this geological file as if it were a fable from distant lands. Extract the raw physics that lies at its core. The monk did not survive because the mountain took pity on him. He survived because he executed the law of thermodynamic sovereignty. The 3D universe has no power to impose its temperature on an object. It cannot impose itself upon an object that possesses its own internal source of massive combustion and that refuses to open its thermal floodgates. The Himalayan ice is identical to the hostility, rejection, and scarcity of the economic and social matrix surrounding you. The world has wrapped you in soaked sheets. It has thrown financial crises at you that threaten to freeze the pulse of your lineage. It has launched commercial betrayals, seeking to stop the heartbeat of your projects. It has wrapped you in cynicism, envy, and destructive criticism from the grey masses who observe your ascent from the mud. The inertial slave, feeling the market's ice, accepts the world's diagnosis. He tells himself, "The situation is very hard. There is no money. The system is against me." By articulating these words, the slave commits the definitive optical error. He accepts the environment's temperature as an unalterable geological truth. He yields his heat. His chest sinks, his posture slouches, his ambition crystallizes into ice, and his projects die of structural hypothermia. The slave adapts to the cold by becoming another frozen corpse in the cemetery of mediocrity. The architect of the now receives the frozen sheet of a world crisis with terrifying violence. When the world tries to freeze him, the architect applies tactical blindness toward the external thermometer. He sits in the smelting chamber of his own mind. He does not spend a single millisecond of his valuable time complaining about the industry's temperature, for complaining is the confession that you cannot light fire. The architect isolates his consciousness. He diverts all the electromagnetic energy he previously wasted on fear and worry and directs it toward the core of his purpose, toward the vision of his empire already consummated. He exerts crushing pressure on the atomic lattice of his own cells. He ignites the furnace of consciousness. He installs the weight of quantum lead and the unalterable frequency of abundance in his biology, regardless of the 3D misery surrounding him. Through this geometric friction, the Titan begins to generate unbearable heat within. The cold rage of his ambition, converted into industrial will, becomes a fire that burns doubt. His blood warms with the mathematical certainty of his own victory. And while the economy sinks into ice, while his competitors tremble in panic and close their companies, the architect radiates a thermal density so massive that the crisis's cold cannot penetrate his electromagnetic shield. The crisis evaporates. Thermodynamic sovereignty is the mandate to become the sun of your own orbital system. A sun does not ask the dark and empty space around it what temperature it should burn at. Space is absolute zero, an abyss of nothingness without heat or life. If the sun were an inertial slave, it would extinguish itself to adapt. But the sun ignores the vacuum. The sun collapses under its own immense gravity, crushing hydrogen atoms in its core until they fuse and generate helium, releasing a storm of photons and lethal radiation that warms entire planets millions of kilometers away. The star imposes its own temperature upon the environment. You must assume the tyranny of the supermassive star. When you enter a hostile boardroom, or when you launch a project to an apathetic market, you do not enter expecting to absorb the room's temperature. If the client is cold, the ordinary salesman gets scared. His voice trembles, and he leaves the room frozen. The architect enters the room with the reactor turned onto 3,000 degrees Celsius. He keeps his shoulders anchored, his gaze heavy, glacial and bored, and his chest emitting the acoustic wave of unshakable authority. You do not try to convince the client with desperate arguments. That is cheap friction. You simply exist in the room with a heat so massive and undeniable that the client's indifference cannot sustain itself. The ice of their skepticism begins to melt under the radiation of your certainty. Your poise generates a high-pressure bubble that displaces the cold of the other. The client seeks your warmth. They will yield to your terms and hand over the gold because human biology is designed to submit to the most stable heat source in its ecosystem. The individual who possesses the fire always rules those who tremble in the dark. You must understand that building inner fire is not a passing emotional state. It is not achieved by listening to motivational speeches that inject a spark of cheap euphoria that goes out with the first puff of wind. Euphoria is like burning paper. It produces a high flame for 3 seconds and leaves only gray ashes. The sovereignty we speak of is the burning of pure anthracite coal. Anthracite is the densest and oldest mineral coal on the planet. It costs a lot to ignite, requiring a furnace with a brutal oxygen draft, but once it ignites, it burns with a blue glow, without smoke, radiating a constant lethal heat that lasts for weeks and melts iron without flinching. This is the goal. To light this geological coal in your chest, you have to embrace the friction of solitary discipline. You have to submit to isolation. The inner fire only ignites when you cut off the nervous system's escape routes. When you feel the cold of fear or uncertainty, your instinct tells you to run to a blanket of distraction. Social media, the opinion of a friend, food, junk entertainment. These are dirty blankets that steal your chance to generate thermogenesis. The master of the forge throws the blanket to the ground. He sits naked in the abyss of his own financial or existential terror. He moves the gear of the intellect. He says, I recognize this 3D event attempts to cool me. I refuse to yield a single degree Celsius. I will not flee to distraction. I will remain in this ice, and focus all my tactical aggression on the geometric solution. That unbearable tension is the spark of flint hitting steel in the core of your cells. Once you master this furnace, the topography of the 3D world will change. You will discover there were never good times and bad times in the economy, but simply eras where it was easier to be lazy, and eras that demanded lighting the boilers to the max. Detractors are just gusts of cold wind hitting an oven door. Thermodynamic sovereignty is the ultimate state of freedom. It is walking through the nuclear winter of a global crisis where thousands of paper empires are collapsing under the weight of ice, and doing so with an open chest, radiating a gravitational force so crushing that opportunities must melt the snow. You are not a dry leaf at the mercy of the wind. You are not a broken thermometer waiting for the weather to change. You are the architect of molecular agitation. You are the furnace of consciousness. Strip off your victim illusions, sit in the center of your storm, and force the ice of the universe to turn to steam. Chapter 5. The Collapse of the Oracle and the Horizon's Attraction. There is a cowardly dogma that has paralyzed humanity since the first men looked at the stars with terror: submission to the tyranny of time. Official history, written by the trembling hands of mediocrity, has taught you to conceive of time as an external force, an invisible and invincible predator that pushes you from behind. You have been indoctrinated to assume the role of the helpless passenger on a rudderless boat, descending through the rapids of a violent river, where your only option is to pray not to crash. The 200 Hz inertial slave looks toward tomorrow with a mixture of pathetic hope and paralyzing panic. He turns to charlatans and economic statistics. He seeks someone to divine his future, because in his optical ignorance, he believes that tomorrow is already written in a book of stone, and that he is only an actor reading a script he cannot alter. This linear and passive vision of time is the most destructive hallucination ever injected into the human bloodstream. It is an absolute denial of the fundamental laws that govern the architecture of the cosmos. To dismantle this chronological prison and assume the crown of the physics of the impossible, we must exhume one of the most censored and misinterpreted mysteries of antiquity. We must travel to the slopes of Mount Parnassus in ancient Greece. We must enter the smoking cracks of the Temple of Apollo, home of the legendary Oracle of Delphi. Orthodox academia has reduced the priestesses of Delphi, the so-called Pythias, to the category of delirious women inhaling toxic gases to babble prophecies at random. Official history paints them as passive figures who simply saw a future. Kings and emperors came to them crawling, offering tons of gold to know if they would win the next war. The inertial account dictates that the Pythia looked toward the current of time, and, like one watching a ship approach from afar, described the inevitable arrival of disaster or victory. This interpretation is an insult to sovereignty. It is a total misunderstanding of wave mechanics. The Pythia was not a passive fortune-teller. She was a gravitational anomaly, an engineer of quantum probability operating in absolute thermal isolation. When the king prostrated before the altar and asked about his fate, the future of that war did not exist anywhere. The battle to be fought the following month was not a solid reality waiting in the dark. It was, in terms of wave physics, an immense cloud of superimposed probabilities. In that abyss of mist, the king won the war, the king died beheaded, the king signed the peace, and the king fled. All these realities vibrated simultaneously. They vibrated in the vacuum of time, lacking 3D mass, awaiting collapse. The true power of the oracle, the heretic secret that classical science tried to erase, resided not in the ability to see passively, but in the brutality of actively collapsing the wave. The priestess entered a state of sympathetic resonance with the unified field. She emitted a mandate of observation of a thermodynamic density so crushing that it forced the mist of possibilities to crystallize. When the Pythia opened her eyes and dictated her sentence, her voice was not describing tomorrow. It was forging the atomic anchoring of tomorrow by pronouncing victory with a glacial certainty. The oracle's hyper-focused attention acted like a laser beam hitting a still pond. The quantum probability wave suffered a cataclysmic collapse. The realities where the king lost or fled evaporated, annihilated by the lack of observation, and the only reality that acquired mass, weight, and density was the one the priestess fixed. The monarch won the war, not because the oracle foresaw it, but because the oracle's colossal mind had injected the lead of inevitability into the atomic lattice of that specific event, forcing the universe to accommodate the logistics of matter. Prophecy was never an act of clairvoyance. It was an act of geometric tyranny. It was the deliberate murder of all alternative realities to force the birth of a single timeline. This is the Codex of Ash that you must swallow and assimilate into your own blood. The future you fear, or the empire you yearn for, are not walking toward you. The future is a mass of inert clay, cold and blind, suspended in the dark. It is you, the architect of the now, who possesses the hammer and the anvil. The universe holds absolutely nothing for you. The universe has no plan for your life. That is the lie of cowards who need a nanny god to exempt them from the responsibility of forging their own steel. The moment you understand tomorrow is an empty canvas. In the moment you understand it begs for a direct order, the terror of the future disintegrates and is replaced by the cold arrogance of the sculptor. But assuming this crown requires a violent restructuring of your internal machinery. The ordinary man who desires success attempts to walk toward it. He pushes, sweats, and crawls. He crawls through the mud of the 3D matrix, believing that if he takes enough steps, he will cross the finish line and reach the horizon where his wealth resides. This tactic is of a shameful aerodynamic clumsiness. The horizon, by optical definition, recedes at exactly the same speed at which you advance toward it. He who pursues abundance generates an opposing wind. His own desperation to arrive creates the friction that keeps him eternally distant from his objective. The solitary king never walks toward the horizon. The architect of the now understands that matter is lazy, but consciousness is infinitely dense. Therefore, he does not move toward the event. He nails his feet to the ground, assumes the immobility of the center of gravity, and forces the horizon to move toward him. This maneuver of high spatial engineering we call the horizon's attraction, and its execution demands the construction of the torsion anchor. Visualize an abyssal canyon. You stand on one edge of the precipice, surrounded by present reality, scarcity, anonymity, or debts. On the other side of the abyss, wrapped in the mist of future time, is the fortress of your consummated empire. Absolute opulence, the monopoly of your industry, dictatorial power over your fate. The inertial slave would look at the abyss, weep at the distance, and start looking for rocks to build a precarious bridge, spending his whole life stacking stones that the wind of chance will knock down. The architect ignores the stones. In the core of his chest, he ignites the boilers of thermodynamics. He takes the steel of his imagination, the carbon of his will, and the fire of his isolation, and forges an immense anchor, a solid titanium harpoon that does not respond to the laws of classical gravity. To this harpoon, he ties a chain of iron links, thick, heavy, and unbreakable. With a movement that lacks all muscular effort and feeds entirely on optical concentration, the architect launches this anchor across the abyss of time. The harpoon crosses the quantum mist of years, flies above useless probabilities, and crashes with a dull and devastating impact directly into the bedrock of his future's fortress. The anchor's hooks sink deeply into the architecture of that specific event, seeking the hard core of assured success and fixing themselves there with an unshakable tension. The timeline has been connected. The collapse of the oracle has occurred. The future is no longer a mist of options. The harpoon has bled it and fixed it. And here begins the real work of sovereignty. The architect does not cross the abyss climbing the chain like a frightened monkey. The architect plants himself in his present, takes the chain with both hands, plants his boots on the ground, and begins to pull. He turns on the winch of his own vibratory frequency. Each day of discipline, each hour of focused work, each absolute refusal to participate in the drama of low-frequency masses is a turn of the crank. The architect does not advance toward the future. He rewinds the chain, physically dragging the fortress of tomorrow across the abyss so that it collides with the ground of today. To execute this traction force without being torn apart, you must be prepared for the most severe punishment that 3D thermodynamics can inflict upon a human body: structural torsion tension. When you, in your present position, decide to pull on a future event of colossal proportions, the external matrix resists. Present reality hates change. The iron chain links tighten until they emit a sharp and metallic sound. Friction becomes unbearable. The 3D world will try by all means to make you let go of the chain. It will send you a cash flow crisis that will burn your hands. It will send you the betrayal of a partner. It will surround you with family and friends who will scream in your ear to let go of the steel, that you are going crazy, that the chain is too heavy. The chain will begin to heat up, red hot, the product of friction between the reality you refuse to accept and the empire you are forcing to materialize. 99% of men who once dared to dream of power surrender exactly at this point of torsion. They feel the heat of the chain burning their flesh. They feel the lactic acid of doubt flooding their bloodstream. They cannot bear the cognitive dissonance, and with a groan of defeat they open their hands. They let go of the anchor. By releasing the tension, the future violently recedes into the mist, lost forever, and the man falls to his knees in his present misery, consoled by the mob that tells him he at least tried. The atomic difference of the architect of the now is that his hands are coated in optical asbestos. The solitary king does not let go of the chain, no matter how many degrees the metal reaches. When present reality tries to burn him with the apparent evidence of a temporary failure, the architect applies quantum lead. He hardens the muscles of his face. He cools the beat of his heart. He understands, with the bored brilliance of a physicist calculating a breaking load, that the heat and pain in his hands are not proof that he is failing, but the irrefutable thermodynamic confirmation that the object on the other side of the abyss is immensely massive and that the traction force is working. The resistance of the world is not a punishment. It is the metric of your imminent victory. You maintain the posture. You do not yield a single millimeter of the gained chain. You become a monument to geological stubbornness. If the market closes a door, you keep pulling. If finances plummet today, you keep pulling. You do not look at the burning chain. You fix your eyes, blind to the surrounding tragedy, solely and exclusively on the distant form of the approaching fortress. And due to the unshakable law of materials physics, if the pillar holding the winch is infinitely denser than the ground around the anchor, the ground yields. Suddenly, the resistance gives way. The fabric of space-time, unable to bear the monstrous atmospheric pressure of a consciousness that refuses to submit to the evidence of the moment, suffers a fissure. The mist breaks. Friction disappears in a millisecond. The massive future, the monopoly of your industry, the generational wealth, the absolute respect of your enemies, displaces with accelerated violence and collides with a deafening crash against the firm ground of your present. You have become a human gravitational lens. In the astronomy of the absolute, when a hypermassive star occupies the center of the vacuum, its density is so overwhelming it bends space and time. Light from distant galaxies does not travel in a straight line. It is hijacked, twisted, and absorbed by the core's gravity. By anchoring your will on the horizon and refusing to walk toward it, you have created a gravitational curvature in your own lifeline. Opportunities, capital, and the minds of key allies that wandered through the economy's cosmos have been caught in your gravity's well, falling at terminal velocity directly into your palm. The true miracle of collapse does not occur in the outside world. It occurs in the vaulted chamber of your own psyche. It occurs through the annihilation of hope. We have spoken of this, but here it takes its maximum destructive expression. The horizon's attraction demands that you deactivate hope forever, because hope is the tacit recognition that a statistical possibility of failure exists. The Pythia did not have hope. She emitted the acoustic order of victory. To operate the heavy machinery of quantum attraction, your physiological relationship with the future must transmute into an unmovable memory. The thermodynamic paradox of this level of mastery is that you cannot attract toward you something your nervous system labels unachieved. The mammalian brain, by ardently desiring something, secretes the cortisol of scarcity stress. But when you close your eyes and submerge yourself in the freezing bath of quantum lead, you do not fantasize about tomorrow's empire. You force yourself to remember the empire as an event that happened 5 years ago. You subject your biology to the coldness of consummated history. You modify the posture of your shoulders, the depth of your breathing, and the pressure of your jaws until perfectly imitating the body architecture of the man who has already won all wars. The brain renders its defenses. It cannot distinguish between an optical signal from the retina and a geometric signal imposed by the dictatorial will of the frontal lobe. It changes your blood chemistry. It expels the anxiety of waiting and replaces it with the crushing apathy of the bored monarch inspecting his full vaults. In this state of majestic lethargy, the tension on the iron chain becomes infinite. The external matrix, bombarded by an electromagnetic signature screaming, "This has already been conquered," becomes disoriented. Quantum friction collapses. The universe cannot allow the internal thermodynamic structure to not match. If the observer vibrates at the frequency of a past victory, the universe is obliged to reorganize the 3D stage, to displace the atoms of banks, people, and material resources at the speed of light, so that the exterior theater matches the non-negotiable order of the interior lens. The collapse of the oracle rips you from the audience and sits you in the director's chair of the material universe. Time is clay. Probability is smoke. Stop asking what fate holds for you, because fate is a beggar waiting for your orders. Abandon the inertial complaint about the delay of your victory. The delay is nothing more than the exact measure of the time it takes to heat your own forge to the temperature where the iron of tomorrow loses its resistance. Rise from the ground. Wipe the ash from your hands. Forge the massive anchor of your mathematical certainty. Look toward the mist. Identify the exact coordinate of the mountain of gold you have decided to claim and launch the harpoon with the violence of a god who has awakened from his amnesia. Listen to the snap of the steel as it sinks into the rock of the future, and then simply plant your feet in the darkness of the now. Turn the crank. Do not let go of the chain. Let the world burn around you. Let the present scream. Hold the torsion until the timeline bends over itself and the empire collides at your back, dragged by the immeasurable force of a mind that, at last, has learned to use its own gravity. Chapter 6. The Curvature of Steel and the Torsion of the Atomic Lattice. The worship of the solid is the most pathetic and universal religion of the human race. Since the forging of the first swords in the Bronze Age, ordinary man has placed a blind and terrified faith in the hardness of metals. He has been taught to measure the limits of the possible by calibrating the resistance of a steel beam. For the 200 Hz inertial slave, steel is the undeniable god of three-dimensional matter. When the ordinary individual crashes against a metallic wall, be it a literal iron barrier or an abstract wall of bureaucracy, his primitive brain emits an automatic diagnosis of impossibility. He attempts to push with muscular force. Upon feeling the implacable repulsion of matter, he surrenders, kneels, and declares that the world is too hard for him. This is the systematic surrender that keeps the empires of mediocrity functioning. But in the shadows of apocryphal history, there are records that shatter this illusion of rigidity and structural hardness. These records prove that hardness is not an inherent property of matter, but a simple electromagnetic agreement that can be revoked by the dictatorship of a superior consciousness. To understand the thermodynamic miracle of the curvature of steel, we must first descend into the dark mathematical underworld of crystallography. A carbon steel ingot is not a solid and continuous block of inert matter. Under the lens of solid-state physics, steel is an immense and frenetic atomic lattice. It is a vast three-dimensional geometric network where billions of iron atoms are held together in a strict crystalline formation interspersed with carbon atoms. These carbon atoms act as microscopic wedges, preventing the layers of iron from sliding over one another. This specific structure is what grants the metal its terrifying tensile strength and its cutting hardness. However, this colossal rigidity is ultimately an electromagnetic hologram. The atoms do not touch each other. They are suspended in an unfathomable vacuum, held in formation solely by the unceasing tension of their own atomic bonds, like an army of frightened soldiers holding tightly to each other's arms, refusing to break ranks for fear of disintegration. Steel is hard solely because its atoms are convinced of a geometric necessity. Physical hardness is nothing more than a state of collective atomic stubbornness. Hidden records of humanity tell of men and women who, without possessing extraordinary muscle mass or using industrial smelting furnaces, took thick bars of steel between their bare hands and bent them as if they were fresh flower stalks. Scientific orthodoxy, terrified by this thermodynamic blasphemy, attempted to censor these events immediately, calling them cheap stage magic tricks or inexplicable circus anomalies. They refused to accept that the atomic lattice could be hacked without the application of mechanical friction or incandescent fire. But the true titans, the operators of quantum optics, know that caloric fire is not the only force capable of altering the crystallography of a heavy metal. Vibration is the absolute master of matter. When an individual manages to silence the hysteria of their mammalian brain, their nervous system transmutes into a transmitter. These men were not applying muscular force upon the metal bar, they were applying quantum torsion upon the metal's belief. Consider the exact mechanics of this apocryphal intervention. When the inertial slave attempts to bend a rigid piece of metal, his subconscious mind is screaming in panic, "This is hard, this is impossible." By emitting that acoustic frequency of resistance and fear, the slave is confirming to the steel its own hardness. He is feeding the rigidity of the atomic lattice with the thermal energy of his own terror. A clash of linear forces is produced, and in Newtonian physics, the human body can never overcome forged steel. The architect of the now, instead, approaches matter from an optics of absolute vacuum. He takes the heavy steel bar in his hands, but in the silenced core of his chest, he completely annuls the earthly concept of resistance. He applies tactical blindness to the sensory evidence of the hardness perceived by his palms. To the solitary king, in that millisecond of sociopathic concentration, metal is not an unmovable rock, it is a vibratory illusion, a cloud of atoms suspended temporarily in the mist of quantum possibilities. By denying the rigidity of matter with the unmovable weight of his quantum lead, the architect injects a frequency. He does not push with his biceps, because pushing is accepting friction. He emits an acoustic and electromagnetic shockwave from the center of his will that enters into sympathetic resonance with the covalent bonds of carbon and iron. The invisible order traveling from his consciousness is not a polite request. It is a thermodynamic tyranny. He alters the oscillation frequency of the iron atoms. For an infinitesimal and secret lapse, the crystalline structure of the steel enters a state of quantum confusion. The rigid bonds relax. The internal friction resistance of the metal collapses completely. The steel bar begins to flow. The steel bar, momentarily forgetting the laws of physics that forced it to be an inert wall, undergoes a cold phase transition and begins to flow between the operator's fingers with the astonishing docility of warm water or soft clay. Only when the architect has molded the metal in the exact curvature does he withdraw. He cuts the flow of the imposed frequency like someone turning off a high-voltage switch. Instantly, the billions of atoms of the metal, orphaned from the superior dictatorial directive, cool back into their natural inertia. They desperately seek to recover their stability and reconnect into a new solid matrix. The steel becomes hard, cold, and sharp to the touch of the ordinary world once more, but now its geometry has been altered forever by a solitary mind that refused to believe in its solidity. This is the mechanical miracle of the torsion of the atomic lattice. It is not parlor magic to entertain fools. It is the demonstration of the mathematical superiority of a concentrated wave of consciousness over the primitive vibration of an inert mineral. Extrapolating this geological phenomenon to the architecture of your own empire is the definitive step to abandon the suffocating prison of linear effort. Human society, the global market economy, and corporate power structures are composed of individuals who operate exactly like a lattice of carbon steel. They cling to their antiquated rules, their categorical no's, and their institutional arrogance with extreme rigidity. They create impenetrable monopolies. The market looks like an armored vault designed to leave you outside, shivering in the streets of anonymity. Many aspirants to greatness commit the pathetic error of the frightened barbarian. They see the steel vault of the industry and try to knock it down by headbutting it. They try to force the sale. They plead for attention on social networks, haggle over their prices, argue with desperate logic, and invest monstrous amounts of energy trying to convince 3D matter to yield to their desires. They are using the muscular force of hope against an atomic lattice of bureaucracy and scarcity. They only fatigue themselves. Resistance generates resistance. Every time you force a situation from the anxiety of scarcity, you are injecting carbon into your enemy's bonds, hardening their refusal, sealing the doors, and digging your own financial grave. Mastering the lethal art of steel curvature requires you to become a thermodynamic ghost. The king in his center does not struggle with the market in the exact same way that the master of the internal forge does not struggle with the metal bar. When you face a flat refusal, a monumental logistical block, or an elite client who stands as an unmovable stone wall, your first maneuver is emotional annulment. If authority says no, the inertial slave feels the kinetic impact. His amygdala inflames with terror, and he reacts with anger. The architect hears the no and processes it with the same glacial apathy with which he would observe a grain of sand falling in the desert. He does not grant mass to the refusal. Maintaining the geometric relaxation of his shoulders and the dense, slow, and deep breathing of quantum lead, the architect silently injects his own acoustic frequency into the room. He applies the torsion of his certainty upon the mind of the interlocutor. He does not debate reasons for the rejection. To debate is to accept the terms and the battlefield of the opponent. The architect alters the electromagnetic field of the entire negotiation by holding, in the dark core of his own psyche, the photographic and brutally bored image of victory already consummated. He ignores exterior resistance with conviction. Imagine the unbearable atmospheric pressure of a consciousness that completely refuses to register reality's rejection. The individual opposing you, who was so sure of his steel rules, begins to feel an acoustic dissonance in his own mind. His atomic lattice of justifications heats up under your gaze. Finding no hard defensive surface against which to crash because you have withdrawn the privilege of your friction, his aggression quickly dissipates into the vacuum. The tension of his bureaucratic bonds relaxes under his own confusion. Suddenly, without you having raised your voice, the client hesitates. The airtight investor shifts in his chair. The authority that closed the door to you experiences a critical failure in its own inertial logic and yields. The steel matrix flows like hot water, reorganizing hurriedly to deliver the contract and the keys to the empire simply because you stripped the rigidity. Dangerously, this absolute power demands an immaculate optical hygiene that few mortals can endure. The curvature of steel in the social and financial matrix admits no degrees of uncertainty. If you hold the metal bar of your negotiation and harbor a micro-doubt, the miracle collapses catastrophically. Doubt is destructive acoustic interference. It is a huge crack in the lens of your projector. By doubting, you interrupt the injection of the new frequency, and the metal of external reality instantly cools, solidifying in a fraction of a millisecond. Your plans crash into the relentless hardness of physics. If you attempt the Titan's posture, but are deep down terrified of public opinion, the 3D matrix will smell the rust of your weakness and crush you with the blind force of an anvil. Claiming this sovereignty irreversibly demands eradicating the concept of linear effort from your neurology. You have to learn to inhabit a state of dictatorial certainty where the laws of men and mathematical probabilities are perceived as docile suggestions, never as non-negotiable laws of gravity. When the system warns that you need 10 years of sweat to forge your fortune, laugh in the face of that metric. Time is simply a dilation of space that obeys with servility the density of the mass occupying it. If you densify your will to reach the atrocious pressure of a stellar core, you can compress 10 years of a slave's work into the brutal torsion of 6 months. You are the thermonuclear forge. Acquiring this unnatural skill is a process of biological death and mechanical resurrection. You have to shoot and kill the slave within you, the one who still believes that nobility resides in sweat. You have to annihilate the part of you that feels a perverse pride in suffering or bleeding against walls. The pride of suffering is nothing more than the cheap consolation medal that inertial losers hang on their chests to justify their failure. The true Titan does not bleed trying to break the wall with punches. The Titan walks through the wall because he has shattered its molecular geometry first. Gaze with contempt upon the high steel columns that sustain the limits of your current life, the financial ceilings that society has convinced you are impossible to pierce, the immense power figures of your industry who intimidate you with their titles. Observe them with laser attention, but withdraw respect. Strip them of their false geological authority. See them for what they truly are in the darkness of quantum physics, simple clouds of diffuse atoms vibrating in an abysmally empty space, held only by collective terror. Do not give them a single joule of your thermal energy through worry. Take a deep breath, settle the crushing heaviness in your abdomen, apply the geometric torsion of your unnegotiable conviction, and bend the world to your absolute whim. Steel has always been waiting, submissive and in silence, for a superior consciousness to give it the permission to melt. This level of quantum torsion is not a lazy trick to avoid work, but the highest, purest, most efficient, and most violent form of 3D intervention. The slave's work is performed on the surface of the problem, breaking nails. The architect's work is performed at the atomic nucleus, altering the situation's DNA. Life will cease to be a tragic war of attrition to become a dazzling symphony of fluid engineering. You will observe how the most massive, ancient, and respected obstacles of your industry yield before your advance with a smoothness that borders on the disconcerting. Others will look at you with awe. Never explain the mechanics of torsion to them. The 200-hertz slave does not have the thermal capacity nor the intellectual resistance to understand that magic does not exist. They cannot accept that the universe is simply a Swiss watch of acoustics and electromagnetism. They prefer to believe in luck. While they break their hands and bleed hitting cold iron in vain, you will continue bending reality around you with the simple and bored execution of a heavy gaze that refuses, with the force of a galaxy in formation, to accept the existence of the impossible. Chapter 7. The Biological Shield and the Walk upon the Plague. The vulnerability of the flesh is the foundational dogma upon which the temples of inertial medicine and the philosophy of human weakness have been erected. From the first breath in this three-dimensional world, the ordinary individual is injected with a paralyzing biological lie, the belief that their body is a fragile vessel. It is a fortress with its doors wide open, eternally at the mercy of microscopic armies, freezing winds, and invisible forces seeking its destruction. The 200-hertz slave walks through life convinced that their health is a statistical lottery, a fragile chemical balance that can be overthrown at any instant by a pathogen. This collective hallucination has created a civilization of spiritual and biological hypochondriacs, beings who tremble at the breeze, who hide behind cloth masks and sterilization walls, begging the gods of probability that the scythe of infection passes by their doors. They assume disease is an entity with its own authority. They see it as an active invader against which the only defense is physical evasion or anatomical surrender. This doctrine of microscopic terror is a thermodynamic aberration and a pathetic renunciation of the sovereignty of consciousness over matter. If we descend into the apocryphal archives of humanity, we will find records. In those dark episodes where death walked freely through the streets and entropy devoured entire empires, we find records that shatter the narrative of vulnerability. We speak of the great plagues of history. During the Black Death that annihilated half of Europe or the cholera epidemics, the behavior of the herd was predictable. Absolute terror was the rule. Fear, in its strictest physical formulation, is a vibratory frequency of very high friction and very low density. When the masses saw their neighbors fall, their cerebral amygdalae ignited in flames, flooding their bloodstream with the cortisol of panic. This terror acted as a corrosive acid. It eroded the structural integrity of their own cells. By vibrating at the frequency of imminent death, the slave lowered the drawbridges of their biology, turned off their electromagnetic shields, and emitted an acoustic signal of submission. The bacteria did not kill the host in an act of war. It simply occupied a territory. It occupied a biological territory that had already surrendered its vibratory authority. The host invited the parasite through the phenomenon of sympathetic resonance. However, in the midst of this ocean of corpses and putrefaction, silenced history tells us of geological anomalies with human form. These were individuals who walked through the three-dimensional hell without suffering the slightest scratch. Gravediggers who carried infected bodies on their bare backs. Hermetic doctors who breathed the same putrid air in closed rooms. Men and women who moved among the plague with the bored tranquility of a monarch. They did not use sealed suits, nor possessed magically superior genetics. Orthodox science, unable to explain how a human body could submerge itself in a bath of lethal pathogens and emerge immaculate, labeled these events as natural immunity or simple statistical oddities. Orthodoxy always uses statistics as a rug. They use it to sweep away the mysteries that threaten their linear understanding of the world. The true mechanics behind this invulnerability have nothing to do with the luck of antibodies. It is a feat of electromagnetic engineering and cellular crystallography. It is the dictatorial execution of the biological shield. To understand the invincibility of the flesh, you must abandon the microscopic vision and adopt the optics of astrophysics and advanced electromagnetism. Contemplate planet Earth, suspended in the vacuum of space. Our world is bombarded every second by solar storms of indescribable thermonuclear violence. Lethal cosmic rays would sterilize the surface of the globe in a matter of hours. If the Earth depended solely on its physical atmosphere, on its layer of gases, it would be dead and scorched. But the Earth possesses a molten iron core spinning at dizzying speeds, a colossal dynamo that generates an immense magnetic field. The magnetosphere is this invisible shield extending thousands of kilometers into space. When the lethal radiation from the sun crashes against the magnetosphere, there is no physical battle, no material friction. The radiation is simply deflected, forced to slip along the magnetic lines of force and thrown back to the vacuum. The shield does not fight the solar fire. The shield, by its pure electromagnetic density, makes the impact geometrically impossible. Your human body is an exact, fractal, and biological replica of this planetary system. The molten iron core is your heart, the most powerful electromagnetic generator of your entire anatomy. It is capable of emitting a toroidal field that extends several meters beyond your physical skin. But the strength, density, and impermeability of this shield are not automatic. They depend entirely on the dictatorial order that descends from the frontal lobe of your consciousness. When the slave operates from fear, when he operates from scarcity, doubt, and terror of the plague, his core spins erratically. The electromagnetic field becomes weak, porous, and full of geometric fractures. His biological magnetosphere collapses. Then, when the microscopic pathogen, or the toxic energy of modern civilization, approaches, it finds no barrier. It penetrates the cellular atmosphere and devours the system. The individual who walks upon the plague, the architect of the now, has learned to operate the boilers of his own central dynamo. The secret of the apocryphal walkers resided in their absolute, glacial, and almost sociopathic vital arrogance. They did not fear death because they had deposed death from its imaginary throne. They walked among the infected wrapped in the quantum lead of unmovable certainty. Their consciousness was so anchored in the superiority of their own thermal mandate that their hearts beat with a slow, heavy, and coherent rhythm. This acoustic coherence inside the chest generated a colossal electromagnetic induction. At a cellular level, this phenomenon translates into a direct alteration of the membrane voltage. Each cell of your body is surrounded by a lipid bilayer, a biological containment wall that operates through an electrical gradient. Science knows that a diseased or weakened cell presents a low voltage, a drop in its surface tension that allows viruses to dock and penetrate its walls. But when the architect imposes the dictatorship of his invulnerable will over his own blood, the voltage of each of his trillions of cells skyrockets. When he flatly refuses to accept the possibility of infection, the cell membrane tightens, becomes rigid, and highly polarized. It is here where the pathogen meets the supreme law of quantum physics. The virus, the bacteria, or the bacillus of the plague are not intelligent hunters. They are simple packages. They are machines of entropy operating at very low vibratory frequencies, the frequencies of decomposition and chaos. The parasite requires, by thermodynamic necessity, a host that vibrates in a complementary frequency in order to anchor itself. A frightened and depressed host is the perfect docking port. But when the pathogen tries to approach the architect's cells, it crashes against a wall of diamagnetic repulsion. The Titan's cell vibrates with the density and voltage of a neutron star. The disparity of frequencies is so brutal that physical interaction becomes mathematically impossible. The virus is repelled. It is bounced or simply disintegrated by the immense thermal friction generated by the host's electromagnetic shield. There is no infection because the lock and the key belong to completely incompatible thermodynamic universes. The architect breathes the toxic air and the bacilli enter his lungs. They hit the walls of alveoli, charged with the electricity of an imperial will, and are expelled back to the outside as harmless ash. The flesh has become untouchable. This dynamic of absolute magnetic repulsion, similar to the Meissner effect in superconductors, is the key to understanding sovereignty. The biological shield is not a passive defense, it is an aggressive imposition of geometric order over the surrounding chaos. Whoever possesses this level of control does not walk through the world asking for apologies or trying to dodge the blows of reality. He walks in a straight line, crossing the crossfire. He walks because he knows his own density alters the trajectory of projectiles. But the plague, in the contemporary era, rarely presents itself in the form of black buboes and suppurating pustules. Humanity has managed to corner ancient pathogens with antibiotics, but has left the doors open to another plague. An infinitely more lethal, silent, and destructive plague sweeps away empires, families, and legacies without shedding a single drop of physical blood. We speak of the thermodynamic plague of mediocrity, the virus of financial scarcity, and the collective infection of modern victimhood. This is the new pest. This new Black Death does not travel on the backs of rats. It travels through the acoustic frequencies of hallway conversations. It rides on the waves of news reports and infiltrates your system through proximity to 200 Hz individuals. When you enter a company on the brink of bankruptcy, when you sit down to negotiate in a market in recession, or when you surround yourself with people who have accepted defeat as a lifestyle, you are entering the room of a dying man in the middle of a cholera epidemic. The air is thick, loaded with the miasma of economic entropy. The tension is low and poisonous. The inertial slave who attempts to build an empire but lacks the electromagnetic shield of certainty dives into this environment and immediately becomes infected. Upon hearing the laments of his competitors and absorbing the generalized panic of his industry, his own shields fall. Doubt docks to his projects. Doubt, that silent and corrosive parasite, couples with his membranes. His entrepreneurial voltage plummets. He begins to lower his standards, to doubt his value proposition, to fire his best talent out of fear, and before he knows it, he is coughing blood in the same hospital of failures he swore to escape. He has become infected with scarcity because his perceptive lens accepted the reality of contagion. He believed the external crisis was stronger than his internal thermoregulation. The king at his center, the bearer of the biological shield, executes the walk upon this financial plague with glacial coldness. When the architect enters a market devastated by recession, he does not put on the mask of fear, nor attempts to isolate himself geographically. He plants himself in the epicenter of the economic catastrophe. The architect activates the diamagnetic repulsion of his own vision. He understands the crisis. He understands the crisis is not an all-powerful entity. It is simply a violent rearrangement of capital caused by the panic of the weak. While all other entrepreneurs cough the poison of despair, the architect expands his ribcage and breathes deeply. He ignites the boilers of his own valuation. He elevates the voltage of his certainty to levels unbearable for ordinary human logic. He decrees in the solitude of his anechoic chamber, "I am not part of this chain of contagion. My economy is not connected to the network of your scarcity. My empire is an autonomous life support system. It is fueled exclusively by the density of my attention and the asymmetric superiority of my movements." By emitting this frequency of massive lead, the architect becomes literally immune to the laws of economic gravity that are crushing his rivals. While the competition contracts and dies, he acquires. He acquires assets at penny prices. While brilliant talent is fired by frightened managers, the architect opens the doors of his fortress and recruits entire armies. The news of disaster crashes against the wall of his tactical indifference and disintegrates. Laments do not alter the tuning of his strings. He walks through the blood and smoke of the market collapse without staining his boots, because his electromagnetic shield repels the very vibration of defeat. To maintain this structure of optical asbestos, you must master the most misunderstood and sacred virtue, the cruelty of detached compassion. The moralistic slave believes that being good implies sitting in the mud to cry alongside the fallen. He believes that empathy requires lowering his own vibratory frequency to match the suffering of the infected. This is the recipe for a thermodynamic genocide. If you see a man drowning in a river, if you jump into the water gripped by panic, without knowing how to swim and without a lifeline, the desperate man will cling to your neck. He will drag you to the bottom and both will die. Your empathy was an act of structural weakness that cost 2 lives. The true monarch never lowers his shield. The monarch never lowers the temperature of his shield to please the dying. When the architect observes the mass falling under the weight of the 3D plague, be it biological disease or financial ruin, he does not experience inertial pity. He observes from the shore, anchored in the bedrock of his own discipline. His greatest act of compassion toward the human race is not to weep with them. It is to keep his shield ignited at maximum power. He burns with a fire so unshakable, heavy, and triumphal that his simple existence becomes a beacon of lethal light that breaks the hypnosis of terror in those with consciousness. You are the steel bridge suspended over the abyss of the pestilence. A bridge has no mercy for the turbulent waters that roar below. A bridge imposes its rigid geometry upon the vacuum, supporting thousands of tons of atmospheric friction through the purity of its internal tension. If you flex, it collapses. If you flex your structure to feel the suffering of the water, the bridge falls. You have to demand from your biology and your psyche a clinical rigidity in the face of collective tragedy. This mandate extends to how you manage your own language and your optical diet. You cannot forge the shield if you let infection in. Language is the chisel that carves the atomic lattice of your immediate reality. If you walk through your company saying, "Times are very difficult," or "We will try to survive this year," or if you mutter, "I am exhausted," you are executing a sabotage of high treason against your own immunological system. You are ordering the nucleus of your cells to lower their shields. You are sending a direct acoustic signal to the lipid membrane to open its pores and let entropy in. The architect of the now has erased the vocabulary of surrender from his source code. His words are molten lead falling on the present mold. He speaks of abundance as a geological fact. He describes his health as an indestructible combustion engine. He dictates the growth of his empire in the midst of the crisis with the monotonous coldness of one reading a report of a past event. By imposing this dictatorial language, the primitive brain obeys. It obeys the acoustic illusion and triggers the corresponding neurochemicals. Cortisol disappears. Testosterone, structural dopamine, and cellular growth factors flood the blood. The body is armored. It does not matter how suffocating the mist of mediocrity becomes in your city. It does not matter if news demands it. It does not matter if your partners doubt the solidity of the ground or if the demographic and economic winter seems endless. The external plague is simply a physical exam of material resistance designed by the cosmos to purge the dross of the surface and reveal who is made of cheap carbon and who is titanium. Close the floodgates of your cheap empathy. Erect the electromagnetic wall of vital arrogance. Isolate the boiler of your heart from the cold of the outside and push the voltage of your cells to the point where flesh becomes immortal matter against entropy. When you crystallize this tension, you can walk the valley. You can walk the valley of economic, social, and biological death with the slow and bored pace of the alpha predator, breathing deeply the smoke of the surrounding destruction and exhaling only the fire of your own eternal and invulnerable sovereignty. Let the plague consume the weak who surrendered. You, the king at his center, are busy building the empire upon the fresh ash. The laws of nature wait for your resonance to decide which cells will remain standing. The frequency of the monarch is the only antibiotic that works against the entropy of the masses. Ignite the core. Chapter 8. Ghost Armies and the Terror Hologram. The glorification of bloodshed is the fundamental pedagogy with which empires of inertia have educated their slaves over millennia. You have been indoctrinated in the bestial belief that conquering a territory or dominating a market requires non-negotiably the physical clash of matter. History books are full of odes to muscular force. They are filled with the clash of iron swords, the friction of infantry, and the thermodynamic exhaustion of sieges. This narrative has sculpted in the ordinary man the illusion that to win a war, he must sweat, bleed, and wear down his biological machinery in a head-on collision. The slave assumes victory is a prize for those who endure pain. However, in the darkness of classified files and chronicles that academics censored out of fear of their own lethargy lies a heretical truth. The most colossal, definitive, and absolute battles in human history never required a single blade to be drawn. They were won through acoustic annihilation and the optical projection of terror. To understand the terrifying asymmetry of frictionless war, we must elevate our optics above the mud and enter the science of fluid dynamics and barometric pressure. The battlefield, like a modern boardroom or the global financial market, is not an empty space. It is an ocean of gases, a dense fluid of air, sound, and electromagnetism. When an army of ordinary men gathers, the sum of their erratic heartbeats and breaths, shortened by fear, generates a specific thermodynamic signature. Fear is a high-entropy, low-vibration emotion. A frightened army, no matter how large, operates as a low atmospheric pressure system. Their molecules are scattered and chaotic. They are an unstable mass, a dust storm lacking a gravitational core to sustain it. Facing this fog of collective panic, apocryphal history reveals commanders who understood they did not need to match the enemy's numbers to annihilate them. They understood that a single human body can be transmuted into high barometric pressure. These titans of antiquity did not lead suicidal charges. They stood atop a hill, anchored their boots in bedrock, silenced their amygdala, and ignited the reactor in their chest until reaching perfect acoustic coherence. They emitted a standing wave of pure gravity. Fluid physics dictates that high pressure always crushes low pressure. War was thus fought and won in the invisible firmament of electromagnetic shockwaves long before the infantry crossed the plain. There are records in the desert valleys where immense armies, armed to the teeth, crumbled in absolute panic and fled at nightfall, massacring each other in the dark without a single arrow being fired. Official narrative attributes these events to wrathful deities or tactical confusion. The science of quantum optics and applied acoustics catalogues them under their true name: the projection of the terror hologram and vibratory intrusion. Let us analyze the optical anatomy of this military miracle. In light physics, a hologram is not an object with mass. It is a 3D interference pattern created by the intersection of two wave sources. To create a hologram, a laser beam, coherent ordered light where all photons march in phase, is required to hit an object and overlap with a second reference beam. The commander who mastered zero friction operated like that industrial laser. In the stillness of the night, positioned before the enemy camp, this man sent no spies. He isolated himself in his center of gravity. He concentrated his perception until eliminating every trace of doubt, compassion, or fatigue. He generated within himself the icy, ruthless photographic image of the total massacre of his opponents. He did not desire it. He collapsed it as a geological fact that had already occurred. By holding this vision with unshakable atomic rigidity, his biology began to emit an electromagnetic field of extremely high coherence. This longitudinal wave, charged with the geometric information of absolute destruction, traveled through the dense air and crashed directly against the chaotic vibratory field of the enemy. Here, the interference pattern was produced. The commander's unmovable certainty collided with the collective paranoia of the soldiers. The thermodynamic result of this wave clash was an optical and acoustic illusion of catastrophic proportions projected directly into the retinas and eardrums of the frightened men. Within the enemy's anatomy, biological intrusion was lethal. The primitive brain acts as an acoustic resonance box, sensitive to pressure changes. When the commander's high-pressure wave penetrated the camp, the barometric pressure of the air literally changed. Horses reared, sensing static electricity before the men. Soldiers woke, bathed in cold sweat, with the physical sensation of a monstrous weight crushing their sternum. Lacking optical discipline, they made ghosts. They looked into the valley mist, and through the interference hologram created by their own fear and the leader's order, they saw colossal armies of giants advancing. They heard the roar of thousands of war chariots where there was only the wind. They perceived death with such clarity that their discipline suffered material fatigue. The chain of command fractured. Madness seized the mass. They drew their swords and, blinded by geometric distortion, began to slit each other's throats to escape the ghost. The next morning, the lone commander descended into the valley with a majestic pace, claiming territory over a carpet of corpses who had annihilated themselves. This mechanics of distance annihilation is not a buried myth. It is the hidden architecture of all power transactions in modern civilization. The battlefield has changed its bronze swords for glass corporations and high-speed markets. However, fluid physics and the optics of terror remain absolutely unalterable. 99% of modern businessmen and creators are terrified infantry soldiers, reacting to shadows and wasting vital energy in useless head-on clashes. The inertial slave operates under the illusion of linear effort. When he needs to close a contract or submit a competitor, he puts on his cheap iron armor. He prepares endless speeches and presentations full of statistical justifications. He enters the meeting sweating, with a heart beating at scarcity rhythms, emitting the acoustic frequency of a beggar disguised as a warrior. Upon entering the room, his low atmospheric pressure is immediately detected by the predators present. His words, no matter how logical, have no mass. They are pushed by the wind. The board yawns, the investor ignores him, and the slave returns to his cave, believing he lost because his sword was not sharp enough. He ignores with the blindness of the mediocre that the battle was lost in the hallway. The battle was lost because his thermodynamic signature announced his surrender from the first moment. He did not project a hologram of authority. He projected one of need, and the 3D universe always devours those who bleed need. Mastering ghost armies demands that the architect transmute into an electromagnetic projector. You cannot enter a conquest with the hope of winning. You must enter with the geological boredom of one who comes to collect the debris of a war already won. This is the pure and lethal application of environment pressurization. Military execution in the modern world begins in the isolation of the vacuum. Hours before facing the friction of the external matrix, before that definitive meeting or product launch, you must disconnect from low-frequency interferences. There, you invoke the laser of pure attention. You dismantle anxiety and fuse in your internal crucible the cold, crushing image of your unnegotiable victory. Install it in your nervous system as a tactile memory of 1,000 tons of weight. When your heart has synchronized its beat with this quantum lead resonance, you become a coherent emitter. You have built your ghost army. Behind your physical figure, an infinite phalanx of gravitational pressure aligns. Observe the physics of your entry into the boardroom of reality. When you cross the threshold, you enter accompanied by the immense mass of your certainty. You do not walk fast, for speed is the refuge of the frightened. You walk with the glacial slowness of a supermassive star taking its place in the center. In that suffocating silence, the electromagnetic field you forged crashes against the room's atmosphere. Barometric pressure changes drastically. Those who were chatting with arrogance feel the physical impact of your wavefront. Their systems register the brutal drop in emotional temperature. Without you uttering a single threat, the crystalline lattice of their resistance begins to fracture by the simple impossibility of sustaining their low density against your high pressure. This is where the terror hologram does its work. Feeling your immobility, the brains of your opponents suffer a short circuit. Arrogance is replaced by vertigo. They perceive your deep breathing and assume that if a man is so undeniably calm in the fire zone, it is because he possesses a destructive power they cannot see. They see you as larger, your resources as inexhaustible, and they begin to fear the consequences of opposing you. Frictionless victory is achieved. The competitor, terrified by the invisible force of your electromagnetic display, yields territory without a fight. The elite client, desperate to anchor to the bedrock of your security, signs the contracts on your own terms. The authority figure lowers his gaze and opens the iron door. You have won the most brutal siege war of the modern market while remaining motionless. Never feel pity for the structural weakness of the opponent who collapses. Thermodynamic compassion does not exist. If an iron beam bends under steel, the steel does not apologize for being denser. It simply occupies the space. Humanity has been conditioned to level down, to ask the fire not to burn so as not to offend the ice. This doctrine keeps civilization in the swamp of complacency. Your duty is to burn with such violence and emit such a devastating shockwave that you force the entire ecosystem to raise its standards or disintegrate. Mastery of ghost armies requires mental hygiene that borders on absolute cruelty toward your own doubts. If during the projection you allow one molecule of anxiety to infiltrate, the laser loses coherence. If you smile to seek approval, the pattern breaks. The hologram turns off, and the predators will devour you. You must learn to love the weight of silence. You have to train your ribcage to bear the tension of doing nothing while the universe waits. Impatience is the acoustic signature of the dead. He who hurries to attack proves his position is not secure. The monarch on his throne does not run. Turn every interaction into a training ground. When you walk through a noisy city, do not shrink to occupy less space. Expand your toroidal field. Fix your eyes on the horizon and walk in a straight line, projecting the wave of solid mass. Observe how the crowd automatically moves out of your way. Take this exercise to the offices of power. When you communicate in writing, strip your words of all pleading fat. Purge the hope. Write with the abrasive dryness of a whetstone. Let your texts be dense and heavy like uranium bricks. Whoever reads your words must feel the barometric weight of your ghost army. War was never about muscles, and empire was never built with sweat. Those who shed their blood were pawns who did not understand the mathematics of waves and the optics of fear. You possess the Codex of Ash. You know the secret of amygdala intrusion and the collapse of the will of others. Turn off the noise, refuge in the vacuum chamber of your own thermal isolation. Ignite the projector of your unshakable attention and unleash the ghost armies of your gravity. Observe with a smile, lacking all mercy, how the 3D world, deceived by your certainty, surrenders and hands you the keys to the city. Chapter 9. The Monarch's Flight and Zero Friction. The oldest, most universal, and unquestionable tyranny that rules the destinies of the flesh is not the dictatorial government of men, nor the cold edge of bronze swords, nor the tyranny of the financial market. The primordial prison of the human species, the pact of submission signed at birth, is the law of gravity. From cradle to grave, the inertial slave is indoctrinated in absolute reverence for his own weight. He is taught to conceive of his body as a heavy sack of meat, a clumsy object condemned to be dragged incessantly toward the center of the earth by an invisible force. Classical physics consecrated this surrender. It declared that every mass attracts another, and man, being tiny compared to the planetary sphere, has no choice but to live on his knees, crushed against the ground. This belief in the inescapability of weight filters from the soles of shoes into the very architecture of human psychology. The individual walks hunched. Dismantling this gravitational hallucination requires that we profane the altars of traditional physics and open the sealed vaults of apocryphal history. Throughout millennia, in secluded monasteries in Tibet and isolation cells in medieval Europe, chronicles have been recorded that orthodoxy tried to incinerate. These are the files of spontaneous levitation, meticulous accounts of men and women who, plunged into states of extreme thermodynamic isolation and absolute optical concentration, simply detached from the ground. Their bodies rose in the dark air, defying planetary attraction with the same indifference as smoke. Religion labeled these as mystical raptures, claiming angels held the saints by their hair. Science, terrified by the rupture of its monopoly over matter, catalogued them as collective hysteria or visual fraud. Neither faction had the intellectual honesty to look at the phenomenon under the light of quantum mechanics. Those ascetics were not being lifted by ethereal entities. They were executing, at a cellular biological level, a geometric phase transition identical to what modern materials science observes in superconductors cooled to absolute zero. They were altering their electromagnetic signature to expel gravity from their atomic tissue. Contemplate the supreme elegance of the Meissner effect in superconductor physics. When a specific ceramic material is submerged in liquid nitrogen, its temperature drops drastically until it caresses the limits of absolute zero, the point where thermal agitation and molecular entropy completely vanish. In that state of perfect atomic stillness, the material undergoes a miraculous mutation. Its electrical resistance drops to zero, and it becomes a perfect diamagnet. If you bring a powerful magnetic field near this superconductor, the material is not attracted or crushed. It generates currents that expel the field lines. The empirical result of this absolute repulsion is quantum levitation. The material remains suspended in the vacuum, anchored in three-dimensional space without touching the surface, floating in a state of zero friction. The apocryphal monarchs of antiquity were not defying gravity. They were rewriting their relationship. They were rewriting their relationship with the Earth's core. Gravity is not an inescapable steel hook. It is an electromagnetic pact, a vibratory conversation between the mass of your body and the mass of the planet. And like every pact in the quantum universe, it can be revoked if one party alters its resonant frequency. Through the ruthless purge of their passions and the sociopathic annihilation of earthly attachments, these individuals achieved the biological equivalent of absolute zero. By removing all internal friction of doubt and fear, their carbon bodies became human superconductors. They expelled the Earth's gravitational field. The universe, obedient to the laws of diamagnetic repulsion, had no choice but to let them float. Transporting this geological miracle from the past to the trenches of your contemporary ambition is the definitive step to reclaim the throne. You do not need to physically levitate to demonstrate your mastery. What you are obliged to execute, to forge an empire that escapes time, is the application of this superconductivity to the topography of your own commercial and structural life. You have to reach the state of zero friction. You have to learn the monarch's flight. Understanding friction is the first mandate to annihilate it. In fluid dynamics and aerodynamic engineering, drag is the force that opposes the movement of a solid body through a fluid, whether water, air, or human interaction. When an irregular object moves at high speed, it breaks the boundary layer violently. Molecules swirl behind the object, forming destructive vortices. Image comparing laminar flow, smooth parallel lines, versus turbulent flow, chaotic swirls and eddies. This is what physics calls turbulent flow. Turbulence absorbs monstrous amounts of kinetic energy, transforming speed into useless heat and destructive vibration until the object stops completely, crushed by the weight of the air it stirred. The inertial slave crosses existence, generating a deafening turbulent flow. His psychology is full of sharp edges, cracks of insecurity, and emotional asymmetries. When he attempts to move toward success, he crashes against opinions, argues with critics, and seeks validation. Each time he responds to an insult or justifies failure, the slave is creating a giant vortex of turbulence. This social friction exhausts his thermodynamic energy. He feels life is an unbearable war of attrition. He moves one step forward and two back, dragged by the giant parachute of his own need for interaction with chaos. He dies convinced the world's resistance was too strong for his shoulders. The architect of the now, the king at his center, navigates the same fabric of reality under the unshakable laws of laminar flow. Laminar flow occurs when the geometric design of the body is of such glacial and aerodynamic perfection that the fluid is forced to separate smoothly and slide along its surface. The fluid does not slow the object, it simply moves aside out of respect for its unnegotiable form. To achieve this aerodynamics in the 3D world, you must apply metallurgical polishing to your own ego. You must remove every protrusion of fragile pride and every indentation of guilt. Social friction can only occur if you offer a surface against which the world can rub. If a competitor launches a corrosive offense and you stop to respond to defend your honor, you have deployed a sail to catch the wind of their envy. You have generated friction. You have lost your state of superconductivity. You have allowed the magnetic field of the other to penetrate your crystalline lattice. The absolute monarch does not defend his honor with words. His honor is a lead core so dense that insults orbit and disintegrate before touching his attention. When the architect is attacked, his surface is optical Teflon. It is a quantum Teflon so perfect that hostility slips without transferring a single joule of heat. There is no response, no grimace of disgust, only a glacial and bored continuation of his own geometric trajectory. By denying the friction of the clash, the architect continues to ascend intact and silent. However, friction does not only come from clashing with others. The most destructive and heavy gravitational anchor that keeps you tied to the ground is not forged with the iron of your enemies, it is forged with the oxidized lead of your own past. The weight is the tonnage of your own historical identity. Examine the anatomy of psychological weight with the loop of a crystallographer. What is trauma? What is guilt or regret for a business opportunity lost a decade ago? They are not philosophical concepts. They are structural knots, real deformations in the atomic lattice of your nervous system. Every time you remember a betrayal and feel your chest contract, you are ordering your basal ganglia to synthesize cortisol. You are injecting toxic matter into your bloodstream. You are adding physical lead blocks to the hull of your own vessel. The slave treasures these lead anchors. He believes his past suffering is his medal of honor. He clings to the narrative of how much he has suffered, because it grants him identity within the herd. He is a granite statue, heavy and unmovable, demanding pity for his scars. But granite does not levitate, stone does not fly. The quantum universe abhors excess inertial luggage. If you want the market's gravity to let you go, you have to empty your holds until only the bones of pure will remain. The monarch's flight requires a sociopathic amputation of emotional memory. You must descend to the boilers of your mind and open the vents. You must throw into the incandescent fire your entire painful biography. You have to incinerate the story of why you are poor or why your family never triumphed. You do not retain a gram of that dross. You apply selective thermal amnesia to yourself. When a memory of weakness surfaces, you evaporate it. You refuse to grant cellular voltage to any thought that is not the static, bored and crushing certainty of your empire already consummated on the horizon. By emptying your consciousness of all parasitic weight, you experience a phenomenon of mass compensation. Your physical body weighs the same, but your signature changes. Your signature in the unified field becomes infinitely light and superconducting. You become a quantum gyroscope. Contemplate the physics of a solid steel gyroscope spinning at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute. Although composed of heavy metal, the kinetic energy in its axis alters its relationship with gravity. If you try to push it or apply a lateral force to knock it down, the gyroscope resists with amazing stubbornness. It refuses to fall. It maintains its upright posture, seemingly suspended at an impossible angle, because the angular momentum of its internal rotation nullifies planetary attraction. That perfect axis of rotation is your internal center of gravity, aligned inexorably with the quantum lead of your victory. When you reach this state of historical emptying, you enter total asymmetry. Muscular effort disappears. You realize the great lie was making you believe success required sweat. Success never required you to push the rock uphill. Success only demanded that you alter the density of your own blood so that the rock, by simple pressure difference, was forced to float around you. In the market, this translates into movements of a fluidity that destroys your competitor's morale. Inertial businessmen work 14 hours a day, suffer heart attacks, and accumulate material fatigue trying to close a single deal. They push the mountain with bare hands. You, in a state of superconductivity, do not push the mountain. You install yourself at your forging bench. You keep the optics clean, the heart cold, and the vibration of abundance locked at maximum tension. You execute a single millimetric action, an email written with the density of uranium, a 3-minute call lacking all pleading emotion, and the external matrix, free of resistance, collapses to obey you. The deal closes in your favor. Resources flow to your vaults at the speed of light without you having to struggle for a penny. The highest caliber allies come to you, drawn by the gravitational anomaly you represent, a man who generates no friction in a world where everyone else is burning with stress. The Monarch's flight is not a flight from the world. It is the maximum thermodynamic penetration into it. Levitating over the 3D fabric means you are no longer subject to the laws of chance or entropy. You are above the line of fire. If a global crisis explodes, you do not fall with the market. You have long since stopped being anchored to the unstable rock of the collective economy. You have expelled that magnetic field from your interior. You float in the frozen vacuum of your own sovereignty, observing destruction beneath you with the apathy of an astronomer recording the death of a distant star. It is imperative that you assimilate the optical cruelty of this state. Upon reaching zero friction, you become incomprehensible and unreachable for the vast majority of the species. Family and old friends will look at you and feel an instinctive rejection. Their bodies vibrate in scarcity. The absolute absence of your friction feels insulting to them. They will try to drag you back to the mud. They will accuse you of being cold or inhuman. Their words, impregnated with the oxidized lead of victimhood, will seek to stick to your hull to force you to sink with them again. This is where your electromagnetic shield must be sealed with molten titanium. Do not feel guilt for the vertigo of your own altitude. Do not apologize for not bleeding. The greatest affront against quantum physics would be to turn off your superconductivity to make the worms feel comfortable. Your thermodynamic duty is not to go down and explain aerodynamics to them. Your only brutal duty is to maintain the laminar flow and continue ascending. Become an anomaly so colossal that their necks break by the impossibility of understanding how a man managed to evade the tyranny of the earth. Renounce the illusion of weight. Throw overboard the altars of sacrifice and the pride of useless suffering. Demand your biology and intellect cease their worship of friction. Align the geometry of your thoughts. Cool the reactor of your fears to absolute zero and enter the state of the perfect diamond. The perfect diamond is that through which light passes without generating the slightest heating. Lift your gaze, nod to the vastness of your own immanent empire, and with a simple act of dictatorial repulsion, detach from the floor of slaves. The entire universe is but air waiting to move out of your way. Chapter 10. The Unmovable Pendulum and the Rotation of the Cosmos. The culmination of human sovereignty, the absolute vertex where quantum physics, the thermodynamics of character, and geometric optics fuse into a single titanium crown, demands the destruction of the species' last and most pathetic illusion, the idolatry of movement. From the dawn of civilization, the inertial slave has been indoctrinated. The slave has been trained in the religion of kinetic energy. He has been taught, with the cruelty of a master who needs pack mules, that progress is measured in kilometers traveled, in drops of sweat shed, and in the frantic speed with which his legs lash the ground. Mass culture worships the busy man, the individual who runs to and fro. He pursues clients, begs for opportunities, and changes direction with every gust of economic wind, wearing out the cartilage of his own life, trying to reach a horizon that always recedes. The slave assumes that if he is not moving, if he is not generating physical friction against the 3D world, he is failing. This is an aberration. This worship of linear velocity is an aerodynamic failure and a total misunderstanding of the laws governing the cosmos. The physical universe has never been ruled by that which moves fastest. The universe is, and always will be, an unconditional slave to that which possesses the greatest mass and refuses to move. To dismantle this kinetic prison and ascend to the throne of quantum statism, we must leave the dusty plains of human warfare and enter the cold, silent, mathematical majesty of celestial mechanics. We must observe one of the most devastating and elegant experiments in physics, Foucault's pendulum. In 1851, under the immense dome of the Pantheon in Paris, physicist Léon Foucault hung a solid brass sphere of nearly 30 kilograms from the end of a 67-meter steel cable. On the marble floor beneath the sphere, he arranged a ring of fine sand. Foucault retracted the heavy brass sphere with a thin cord. He waited for the cable to stop vibrating and cut the cord with a flame, releasing the pendulum without imparting any lateral force. The immense mass of brass began to swing, a slow, heavy, rhythmic, and perfect oscillation. As the tip of the sphere brushed the sand, it traced an unmistakable straight line. The inertial crowd assumed the pendulum would simply swing in that same line forever, dictated by the apparent solidity of the floor. But as the hours passed, the spectators' optics began to suffer a terrifying short circuit. The line the pendulum traced in the sand began to rotate. Millimeter by millimeter it moved. The plane of oscillation of the immense block of brass seemed to be rotating, sweeping the circle of sand like the hands of a cosmic clock. The slave who blindly trusts his 3D senses would look at this and declare, "The pendulum is moving, the pendulum is turning." However, the physicist understands the truth. The pendulum is not turning at all. By the laws of inertia, a body in free oscillation maintains its plane of motion fixed in relation to absolute space, anchored geometrically to the stillness of the distant stars. The steel cable and the brass mass are indifferent to the opinions of the ground. The pendulum was static. The empirical reality is that the pendulum remained absolutely stationary in its plane, and it was planet Earth, with its billions of tons of rock, its boiling oceans, its empires, its economic crises, and its terrified multitudes, that was humblingly rotating beneath it. This is not a mere museum curiosity. It is the exact architectural blueprint of the mind of a titan. The architect of the now, the monarch who has forged quantum lead in his entrails, operates in the 3D matrix exactly like Foucault's pendulum. The solid brass sphere is his unmovable certainty, his sociopathic conviction that empire and power already belong to him. The 67-meter steel cable is the laser beam of his ultra-concentrated attention, free from the cataracts of the ego and tension to the limit of material strength. And the anchor point, up there in the dark dome, is not subject to the rules of society or market fluctuations. It is fixed to the unified field. When the solitary king descends to the arena of the 3D world, he does not run after opportunities. He does not adapt his personality to please the masses. He does not alter his prices or lower his standards because an economic crisis threatens to suffocate the continent. The architect plants himself in his geometric center. He releases the gravitational mass of his will and establishes his plane of oscillation. His movement is heavy, rhythmic, bored, and dictatorial. He declares his sovereignty with a coldness that freezes the blood of his competitors, and then he simply refuses to turn. The 3D market will try to force you to rotate. The market is a chaotic fluid, full of hysterical trends, stock market panics, and volatile opinions. The multitude will shout that your method is obsolete, that you must change your course, that you must look where everyone else is looking. If you yield to that acoustic friction, you break the inertia of the cosmos. You become just another slave, spinning blindly with the herd, losing all your kinetic energy in the turbulence of fear, dizzy and exhausted. Supreme mastery demands that you watch the floor of your industry spin beneath your feet, while you maintain your gaze forward, holding the plane of your oscillation. You endure the cognitive dissonance of seeing that the world is not aligned with you at this second. You feel no terror because you possess the geological knowledge of rotation. You know that if you stay absolutely fixed in your frequency, the 3D matrix will eventually bring the golden power to your line. You do not have to hunt success. You have to stay heavy and still enough so that success has no choice but to cross your path while the world turns. To embody this level of gravitational density, it is imperative to murder the archetype of the hunter. Civilization applauds the hunter. It loves the agile predator. But the hunter is, thermodynamically speaking, a deficient being. He spends enormous amounts of ATP, burns glucose, and fatigues his muscles, all for a reward that often escapes him. If he fails, he starves. His life is an equation of constant friction. The architect of the now looks at the hunter with clinical pity. The monarch does not aspire to be the wolf running through the snow. The monarch aspires to be the supermassive black hole at the center of the galaxy. Contemplate the crushing physics of the cosmic singularity. A black hole does not hunt. It does not move through the vacuum of space trying to catch skittish stars. A black hole occupies an exact point in the fabric of spacetime and does one thing: it accumulates mass unto infinity. It is the definitive triumph of immobility. Its density becomes so mathematically monstrous that it tears the geometry of the universe. It bends the fabric of space, creating a gravitational well. Nothing can escape. Giant stars, rocky planets, and even light photons traveling at maximum speed are hijacked by this non-negotiable curvature. The black hole does not pursue matter. Its simple, still, and glacial existence forces matter to fall into its event horizon, devouring systems in majestic silence. This is the final ballistic instruction for the crystallization of your empire. Your biological and psychological labor in this simulation is not to move faster than others, but to become denser than others. Your mind must become a gravitational singularity. Mass is accumulated through the eradication of noise. Each time you apply tactical blindness and refuse to look at the shadows of the cave, you increase your mass. Each time you receive the impact of the market's ice and ignite the thermonuclear furnace of your chest without a complaint, you increase your mass. You transmute historical victimhood into absolute gold. Above all, each time you anchor the titanium harpoon in the horizon of your future and hold the torsion of the chain regardless of how much your hands burn, your atomic density multiplies exponentially. When you reach critical mass, the event horizon of your own life expands. You no longer need to persuade anyone. Persuasion is the language of light objects that need the permission of the air to fly. You do not ask permission, you curve the air. You enter a negotiation, and your silence is so dense it absorbs the oxygen in the room. Authority figures who once intimidated you now feel disoriented, dragged by an invisible force. They are forced to orbit around your ideas. Their own electromagnetic fields, weak and scattered by the entropy of fear, collapse upon contact with the limit of your gravity. They surrender to you not because your words were sweet, but because fluid physics prevents them from resisting a free fall. The collapse of distance is the definitive symptom of this mastery. The slave measures the distance between his poverty and his empire in years and decades of linear work. He believes time is an immense wall he must scale block by block. But general relativity proves that extreme gravity warps time. By densifying your certainty to the level of quantum lead, you cause an earthquake in the tectonic plates of the unified field. The geological faults of quantum probabilities creak under the weight of your immovability. Temporal distance evaporates. What would take a slave 20 years is delivered in a fraction. It arrives in a cataclysmic collapse of asymmetric opportunities and massive capital injections that fall from the sky like meteors attracted to your core. You did not shorten the distance by walking, you annihilated the distance by folding the map. However, this crown demands a thermal price, absolute isolation. A center of gravity cannot have friends in the vulgar mammalian sense. You cannot sit in the tavern to commiserate with asteroids about why space is so dark. You cannot lower your density to make light objects comfortable. If Foucault's pendulum cared about the sand it was scratching, the experiment would fail. The monarch's love is not the tepid caress that tolerates weakness. It is the emission of radiation so high that it forces those around him to transmute into diamond or move away, burned by their own limits. As your empire crystallizes, the noise of the outside world becomes a distant whisper. The terror of poverty, imposter syndrome, and anxiety about the future, all those pathetic shadows, will disappear completely. Not because you beat them in a debate, but because your gravity crushed them into subatomic particles too small to interact with your retinas. You have cleaned the house through the vacuum. At this vertex, the concept of decision-making becomes obsolete. Decisions are agonizing deliberations in the minds of divided individuals whose mirrors point to 10 different foci. The architect of the now does not decide. The architect executes calculations of material resistance. The math is revealed instantly. Mediocre options discard themselves upon contact with the shield of his non-negotiable standard. Only one route remains, a clean cut, a ballistic strike. Action becomes automatic, heavy, and devoid of emotion. You move through the world of business or war with the glacial precision of a surgeon operating on a corpse. Without hope, without fear, applying only the millimetric force necessary to separate the gold from the useless flesh. This is the true monarch's flight. It is not floating in the clouds playing a mystical harp. It is walking with feet sunk in the rock of the 3D matrix, but operating with an internal ether engine. This engine completely annuls the friction of collective ignorance. You have distilled the alchemy. You have tuned the fork. You have marched in silence around the walls of your own limit and emitted the electromagnetic cry that pulverized the stone. You have unmasked the ghosts and found only empty air. From this heartbeat onward, official history, the news, the economy, and the opinion of the 200 Hertz mob cease to have jurisdiction over your cells. You have signed the atomic secession. Set the crown of your own density upon your brow. Never apologize for the coldness of your gaze. That coldness is the thermal shield protecting the forge of your empire. Do not ask the 3D world to be softer or fairer or easier. Demand your own consciousness be heavier, sharper, and more implacable. You are the unmovable pendulum in the cathedral of the universe. You are the voltic arc beacon. Let the slaves keep running desperately on the wheel of inertia, spending their blood to pursue mirages. You assume the throne of the fixed point. Breathe the thin air of the summit, adjust the structural tension of your silence, and let the entire cosmos rotate obediently beneath the sole of your boot. The forge is finished. Matter is yours. Conclusion: the Titan's Testament. The closing of the heavy vault doors has resonated. The apocryphal files have been exhumed from the darkness, exposed to the destructive radiation of cold logic, and definitively assimilated by the observer's retina. We have descended together into the unfathomable depths of human crystallography and scaled to the icy vacuum of celestial mechanics. You have contemplated with your own eyes the acoustic annihilation of the stone in Jericho, the ignition of the solar furnace on the shores of Syracuse, the atomic transmutation of one's own blood in isolation, and the superconducting levitation of those who refuse to possess weight. Arriving at this geological vertex, the dust of inertial civilization settles. The white noise of official history is stifled, and the architectural truth emerges with a rawness that does not admit a single syllable of negotiation. The Titan's Testament is drafted with the heavy ink of quantum lead. The first and last clause of this foundational document demands the immediate and total annihilation of the concept of the miracle. The word miracle is the acoustic refuge of cowards. It is the crying towel of thermodynamic illiterates who, upon witnessing the absolute submission of matter to a will infinitely more dense, prefer to attribute the event to incomprehensible magic rather than admit their own structural laziness. A miracle has never been a violation of the laws of the universe. It is the exact mathematical and ruthless application of the laws of quantum physics, fluid mechanics, and geometric optics by a solitary monarch who has stopped asking classical physics for permission. The rabble observes how fire does not burn the flesh of the ascetic, or how steel flows like warm water under the torsion of concentrated consciousness. They see a colossal financial empire crystallize from nothing in the middle of a high-entropy global recession and fall to their knees claiming divine intervention or random luck. The architect of the now observes the exact same phenomena and nods in a bored silence, recognizing simple heat transfer and the perfect alignment of resonance. Greatness does not fall from the sky like compassionate rain. It is forged on the dark anvil of isolation, striking the slag of terror with the hammer of hyper-concentrated attention until external reality suffers an irrecoverable material fatigue and surrenders. Therefore, the final invitation of this treatise is an act of intellectual pyromania. You must burn the history books bequeathed to you. Reduce to ashes the biographies of ordinary men who taught you that existence is a valley of suffering, friction, and linear effort. Spit upon the bronze monuments erected to weakness, resignation, sterile empathy, and the concept of destiny. Destiny is a tectonic lie designed by the weak. It is designed to keep low-mass bodies eternally orbiting around someone else's suns. You are not a satellite condemned to revolve in the entropy of the masses. If your current life is a winter of scarcity, it is not because the gods have punished you. It is solely because the lens of your projector is clouded with victimhood. The dense matter surrounding you, the bars in the banks, the contracts, the architecture of skyscrapers, and the acoustic waves of your critics, is atomically docile. It is cosmic clay, suspended in an abyss of empty space, terrified by its own lack of purpose and gravity, silently begging for the traction of a king to impose a geometric form. If you present yourself before this clay with the trembling hands of doubt, emitting the vibration of a beggar, the clay perceives your low pressure, becomes sharp granite, and tears your skin to the bone. But if you approach with the atmospheric pressure of the absolute vacuum, the clay immediately loses its shear strength. It becomes plastic, submissive, and glowing, waiting only for you to sink the pressure of your fingerprints into its atomic lattice. The time of useless hunting is over. The geological era of pushing walls with bare shoulders, bleeding from the nose and complaining about the immense weight of the world, is finished. The universe does not weigh. The universe only possesses mass, and that mass blindly obeys those who know how to concentrate light and sustain temperature. Close this codex, stifle the voices of the 200 Hertz mob pleading from the mud for you to return to the comfort of the cave. Erect the biological shield of your own certainty. Isolate the core of your heart from the inertial cold of the environment. You are no longer a microscopic victim of the outside temperature. You are the thermonuclear forge that dictates the climate of the entire ecosystem. Claim the unalterable plane of your oscillation. Assume the crushing immobility of the bronze pendulum. Observe with a gaze lacking all mercy how the infinite horizon, defeated and fractured by the immense gravity of your silence, is dragged inexorably through the abyss until it collides against the tips of your boots. The Apocrypha of the Mind have been revealed, but the history of matter is now your biography. The lead has crystallized. The fire is yours, the crown is the now.